In the heart of a medieval village, under the heavy sky of a gray dawn, a tired traveler named Elias shuffled across the muddy square, his boots soaked, his cloak damp with mist. He wasn't looking for trouble, just warmth, a bit of bread, and a quiet place to rest. But in the world he wandered, even the simplest things came with rules so bizarre, so tangled in fear and belief, that every step risked a punishment no modern person would imagine. In this quiet village, nestled between deep woods and fog-covered hills, one could be arrested for baking crooked bread, fined for wearing the wrong hat, or even executed for talking to a crow at the wrong hour. It might sound like fiction, but this was medieval Europe, a time when laws weren't just written in books. They were whispered by priests, painted in church frescoes, and carved into wooden signs with symbols no commoner could read. A time when superstition carried more weight than science, and when surviving another day often meant obeying a long list of strange, unwritten rules. Elias had lived under such laws all his life, but even he couldn't understand all of them. And that morning, as he stopped by a public fountain to rinse the mud from his hands, he had no idea he was breaking one. Behind him, a group of children giggled, tossing pebbles into the water. One of them, a girl with a crooked braid and dirt-smudged cheeks, pointed at Elias and whispered, "He's washing before Mass." "That's not allowed, is it?" Another boy nodded seriously. "That's the sacred fountain. Only Father Alan can bless water there. He's cursed now. Maybe he'll turn into a goat." To them, it was just a game. But in a nearby window, a sharp-eyed steward took note. The steward wore a dark green tunic marked with the symbol of a coiled serpent, a mark of the local baron's enforcers. He scribbled Elias's name onto a thin scrap of parchment. Another violation, another trial. But Elias didn't see the steward. He moved on, wiping his hands and stepping into the bakery, where the smell of barley and rye filled the warm air. The baker, a short, broad-shouldered woman named Marta, glanced up. "Back again," she said. "Didn't you hear? They banned rye bread this week. All wheat now. Baron's new tax." Elias blinked, confused. "Why? Wheat doesn't grow this far north." Marta shrugged. "Don't ask me. Ask the stars or the rats or whoever he listens to." "But you didn't hear that from me." These laws weren't just confusing. They changed weekly, sometimes daily. One year, it was illegal to eat meat on Thursdays, unless you were a soldier. Another time, the church declared cats agents of the devil. Thousands of cats were killed, leading to a rise in rats, and worse, the plague. In some towns, people were punished for sneezing in public. In others, it was against the law to whistle after sunset. Many of these laws were enforced not because they worked, but because they kept people afraid and easy to control. Elias had grown used to walking the edge. He knew which herbs could get him accused of witchcraft. He knew not to look too long at a noble's shoes. He even knew to fake ignorance when someone asked the date. It was better to appear foolish than risk contradicting the local priest calendar. But lately, the laws had grown stranger, darker, and people had started to disappear. It began with a blacksmith named Bronick. He was fined for forging a horseshoe on a saint's feast day. A mistake, surely. But when he failed to pay the fine, he vanished. His forge was left cold. His tools were untouched. Then came Alina, a midwife who had used a silver charm to ease a woman's labor. Some said it was sorcery. Others said it was tradition. Either way, she was arrested during evening prayers and never seen again. Her house stood empty, the windows shuttered tight. Children dared each other to knock and run. Rumors grew. People whispered about a secret book held by the Baron, filled with forgotten laws and ancient punishments. A book said to have been passed down from inquisitors, full of curses and rituals disguised as justice. Some said the Baron didn't even understand the laws himself, that he read from the book blindly, choosing pages at random. But still they were enforced. Still people obeyed, because not obeying meant risk. And in this world, risk meant ruin. Elias was no hero. He didn't fight battles or write letters to kings. But he asked questions. And in medieval Europe, that was sometimes the most dangerous thing of all. One evening, he visited the church to light a candle for a friend who died from fever. The priest, Father Alan watched him carefully. "No candles tonight," the priest said. "You haven't confessed." Elias lowered his eyes. "I've done nothing wrong." The priest stepped closer, his voice soft and cold. "Then you'll have no trouble confessing it." That night, Elias sat by the riverbank, listening to the wind rattle dry leaves across the cobblestones. The moon was high, but the village felt darker than usual. He thought of Bronick, of Alina, of others who had vanished without a trace. Maybe they had broken a strange law without knowing. Maybe that was all it took. He decided to visit the steward who had watched him at the fountain. Maybe he could bribe him. Maybe he could beg. Maybe he could learn more about the book. But the steward's home was empty. Inside, the table was overturned. A single candle burned down to a stub, and on the wall, drawn in ash, was a symbol Elias didn't recognize, a circle with 3 thorns. The air smelled of burnt parchment and damp stone. And in the corner, where the steward's cloak had been hung, a piece of it lay torn and scorched. Elias stepped back, his heart pounding. A noise outside. Footsteps. He darted into the alley behind the house, slipping between barrels and crates, ears straining for another sound. Nothing. But when he returned to his room above the stable that night, he found a folded note under his door. No wax seal, no name, just a single sentence written in a shaky hand. "You asked too many questions. You're next." That was how it always began. Quiet warnings, vague threats, and strange laws used like weapons. Elias wasn't ready to run. Not yet. But he knew he had to uncover the truth behind the book, the Baron, and the laws that ruled his life. Because if he didn't, the next law might be written for him. And this time, it wouldn't just be about bread or fountains. It would be about silence, and who was allowed to break it. The morning came slowly, its light pale and hesitant, as if even the sun didn't want to wake the village. Elias sat on the edge of his straw-stuffed bed, staring at the note in his hand. His fingers had smudged the ink during the night, but the words were still there. Asterisk, you asked too many questions. You're next. Asterisk, he read them over and over, searching for some clue in the handwriting, the tone, even the fold of the parchment. But it told him nothing. Whoever had left it had done so with care, precision, and one clear message: stay quiet or disappear. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. The blacksmith's apprentice hammered away at horseshoes, and Marta's bakery chimney puffed white smoke into the cool morning air. Children ran through the square, chasing each other with sticks. But there was a heaviness beneath it all, a stiffness in the way neighbors nodded, a hesitance in every smile. People weren't living. They were enduring. Elias folded the note and tucked it inside his boot. He needed answers, but he couldn't ask outright. Not yet. He started where most rumors began, the tavern. The ale horn was dimly lit, with thick wooden beams and the scent of stale beer and smoke soaked into the walls. The innkeeper, Tommel, nodded when he saw Elias. "You look like death with a headache," he said. "Beer or broth?" Elias chose beer. It would loosen tongues faster. He sat in the corner near the hearth, where the regulars gathered. Old men with creased faces and cracked hands sipped from clay mugs and told stories no one believed. One of them, a half-blind shepherd named Merkez, leaned closer when Elias mentioned the Baron's book. "Careful," Merkez said, his voice a whisper despite the noise around them. "You go looking for old laws, you find old punishments. Things no man should touch." "You've seen it?" Elias asked, keeping his voice low. "No," Merkez said, "but my brothers serve in the Baron's tower." He saw a boy whipped for wearing blue on a fasting day. Blue, just blue. No one even remembered why it was banned. And the boy didn't either. He was 12. Elias's jaw clenched. "That's madness." "It's power," Merkez said, "and fear. That book, if it exists, it's not for justice. It's for control. Each village fears a different law. Each priest preaches a different warning. It keeps us looking down. That's the real trick." Elias thanked him and left the inn before noon. He wandered through the village, keeping to the quieter lanes, watching how people moved and spoke. Fear was etched into the rhythm of their lives. Women crossed themselves twice before picking herbs. Men checked the sky before spitting on the ground, unsure if the clouds above were considered holy that day. A traveling juggler passed through once a month. Last time, he juggled 3 apples and was beaten for mocking the Trinity of harvest. No one knew who made that rule. No one dared repeat it. By afternoon, Elias stood at the base of the hill where the Baron's manor loomed above the village. The building was made of black stone, its tower casting a long shadow even on sunny days. The gate was always closed, guarded by 2 men in matching green tunics. One of them, younger than the rest, shifted nervously when Elias approached. "I need to see the steward," Elias said. "Gone," the guard replied quickly. "Traveled south. No visitors today. But he was here just 2 days ago." "Traveled south," the guard repeated, as if that was all he had been trained to say. Elias nodded and turned away, but his curiosity only deepened. South meant nothing. It was a word used to end conversations. As Elias walked back down the hill, he passed an elderly woman feeding chickens by the side of the road. She looked up and met his eyes, then said in a hoarse voice, "They took him, like they take all the ones who see too much." Elias paused. "You mean the steward?" She nodded. He asked questions. Started wondering why the laws changed. Started keeping records. Thought he was safe because he enforced the rules. She dropped a handful of seed to the ground. But no one's safe, not even the ones holding the whip. He wanted to ask more, but she shook her head and turned away. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lit a candle and sat by the window, listening to the quiet. A dog barked in the distance. An owl hooted. But there was something else, a strange rustling. Then silence. Then footsteps. He pressed himself against the wall as shadows moved past his door. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They were only there for a moment, then gone. He waited until morning before stepping outside. At his doorstep, there was a mark drawn in soot, the same circle with 3 thorns. It was a warning, or maybe a promise. He wiped it away quickly before anyone could see. The next day, he packed a small satchel. He needed to leave the village, not to run, but to learn. If the Baron had this strange book, if these laws were being enforced across other towns and lands, then someone had to have seen it. Someone had to know where it came from. He didn't tell anyone goodbye, just slipped out past the old well and took the forest path east. The road out of the village was rough and narrow. Trees pressed close together, their branches twisted like they had grown under pressure. The deeper he walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, only the sound of his boots and breath. By midday, he reached a fork in the path. One way led to the town of Halden, known for its monastery and scribes. The other led to the ruins of Elder Birch, a village abandoned after a plague. He chose Halden. If there were scholars left in the world who could read forgotten laws and strange languages, they'd be there. The monastery stood on a rocky outcrop, its stone walls weathered and cracked. The monks were quiet but kind, offering Elias a place to sleep and bread with honey. He spent days in their library, digging through dusty scrolls and fading manuscripts. He found records of the old Inquisitions, trials where men and women were sentenced for crimes that weren't crimes, sleeping on the wrong side of the bed, trimming hedges during the wrong moon, speaking Latin in public. He read about kings who passed laws just to punish rivals. He found one entry that chilled him completely. Asterisk, punishment for reciting a forgotten verse, said to invoke the shadow of reason, is dismemberment, to prevent rebellion of thought. Asterisk, what did that mean, shadow of reason? Elias asked one of the older monks, a man named Brother Wren, who had once served in the court of a bishop. The shadow of reason, Brother Wren said, lowering his voice, was a phrase used in secret writings. It referred to those moments when common people started asking too many questions. It was feared more than weapons or fire, because questions lead to knowledge, and knowledge, he paused, leads to disobedience. Elias told him about the circle with the thorns. Brother Wren's face went pale. That symbol, he said, belongs to the Order of the Bound Tongue, a group of scribes and enforcers who believed that silence was sacred and curiosity a sin. Do they still exist? Elias asked. They were wiped out, supposedly, after the last great trial. But their ideas remain. And if that symbol is reappearing, someone is reviving their beliefs. Elias sat in silence, heart pounding. The laws, the punishments, the disappearances, it was all connected. And if someone was bringing back the order, then it wasn't just his village at risk. He needed to return. He needed to warn them. He needed to find the book. But when he rose to leave, Brother Wren placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Be careful. The laws you break may not be written yet." And that's when Elias realized the strangest laws weren't the ones from the past. They were the ones still waiting to be made. And someone, somewhere, was already writing his name on the next page. The road back to Elias's village felt different this time. It wasn't just the weight of what he'd learned at the monastery, or the worn leather satchel slung across his shoulder filled with crumbling notes and sketches from ancient texts. It was the feeling that something unseen now walked beside him. Every gust of wind through the trees, every rustle in the underbrush, made him glance over his shoulder. The silence he once found comforting now pressed in like a warning. When he reached the familiar ridge overlooking the village, dusk had already begun to fall. Smoke curled from chimneys in lazy trails. Children no longer played in the square. The tavern windows, once glowing with laughter and song, were dim. And above it all, casting an unnatural shadow over the village, loomed the Baron's tower. It looked taller somehow, darker, like it had grown while he was away. He entered from the east path, slipping past the old well and into the back lane behind Marta's bakery. The bakery itself was closed, its windows shuttered, the usual scent of warm bread absent. That struck him hard. Marta never closed, not even during storms. Elias knocked gently, waited, then knocked again. No answer. He circled around and checked the tavern. Inside, a handful of villagers sat in tense silence, mugs untouched, their eyes fixed on the fire. Tommel, the innkeeper, looked up when Elias entered. His face lit up for a moment, but then fell. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly. "I needed to," Elias replied. "Where's Marta?" Tommel hesitated. Then, with a quick glance toward the other patrons, he leaned in. "Gone. 3 nights ago. They said she baked with flour not approved by the steward. Said she broke the new purity law." "Purity law?" He nodded. Some nonsense about the wheat needing to be blessed at the solstice. No one heard of it before, but they dragged her out after sunset. No trial. No explanation. Elias sat down, his hands clenched. "Who's they?" Tommel's eyes darted toward the tower. The Baron's new guards. Not the usual ones. These were black gloves. "Don't speak." And they carry symbols like the one you described, thorns in a circle. One appeared on Marta's door the night before. So the order was truly back. Elias wanted to ask more, but a sharp glance from one of the villagers stopped him. Eyes everywhere. Ears too. That night, Elias didn't return to his old room. Instead, he slipped into the woods behind the church and took shelter under the roots of a fallen tree, hidden from the main paths. He built no fire, ate only dry bread, and waited for morning. At first light, he visited the old chapel where Alina, the missing midwife, once worked. The building was unused now, cold and damp. Dust coated the pews. He checked the back room, where she had stored her herbs and books. Most of it had been burned, but tucked behind a loose stone in the wall, he found something, a scrap of parchment, yellowed and scorched, bearing a few hurried words. Asterisk, they punish what they fear. The laws are lies. The book is not holy. It is a lock, not a guide. Asterisk. He held the scrap like a thread pulled from the edge of a mystery. Alina had known something. Maybe more than he did. And maybe that's why she was taken. He had to get into the Baron's tower. That night, using shadows for cover, Elias crept toward the hill. A fog had settled, muffling sounds and softening torchlight. The outer gate was unlocked. That alone was odd. The courtyard was empty. No guards in sight. Only a single lantern flickered by the main doors. He moved quickly, pressing his back to the stone wall, slipping from corner to corner. When he reached the main doors, he paused, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the groan of the wind. The doors opened with a gentle push. Inside, the air was warmer but filled with the heavy scent of wax and old parchment. The hall was quiet, lined with tall banners bearing strange symbols. not the crest of the Baron, but the mark of the circle and thorns. Elias stepped carefully, avoiding creaking boards, and made his way up the winding stairs to the steward's old office. If the book existed, it had to be kept there, or at least hidden nearby. The room was darker than he remembered, its shelves bare, papers gone. But behind the desk, he found a wooden panel slightly cracked at the edges. He pried it open and found a narrow space behind the wall. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a heavy, leather-bound book. It felt cold to the touch. He opened it slowly, and his breath caught. The text was handwritten in a script so jagged it seemed to claw across the page. Each law was stranger than the last. Asterisk, if a man speaks aloud during an eclipse, he forfeits his name. Asterisk, asterisk, if a child dreams of fire, the family must be tested for heresy. Asterisk, asterisk, if 3 birds land on a roof at twilight, the home must be burned. Asterisk, none of it made sense. And yet it had been used, repeated, enforced, feared. Further in, he found notes scribbled in the margins. Not by the original author, but by someone who'd studied the book recently. Asterisk, this is no law book. It is a tool of fear. Asterisk, asterisk, the rules change to match the mood of the powerful. Asterisk, asterisk, the order of the bound tongue believes obedience is purity. They silence those who question to protect the illusion of control. Asterisk, at the very end of the book was a list. Names, dozens of them. Some were crossed out. Some had marks beside them. Circles, lines, strange runes. His own name was there, not crossed out yet. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Elias froze. Then a voice, soft but cold. You should not have read that. He spun around. A figure stood in the doorway, clad in a black robe, face hidden beneath a hood. Black gloves, just like Tomlet said. In his hand, a long staff carved with thorny patterns. Elias backed toward the window. Why are you doing this? These laws, none of them make sense. They don't need to, the man said. They only need to be followed. But they hurt people. Good people. The figure stepped closer. Obedience is safety. Questions are chaos. Elias gripped the book tightly. This isn't order. It's control. And what is wrong with control? The figure whispered. It keeps the fire from spreading. Elias didn't wait. He turned and hurled himself at the window. Glass shattered, and he fell hard onto the muddy ground below, pain lancing through his shoulder. He didn't stop. He ran, book tucked under his arm, heart pounding like a drum. Behind him, alarms rang. Torches flickered. Voices shouted. But Elias disappeared into the fog, just as the village bells began to toll. The laws had been read. The names had been seen. And now, the hunt would begin. Elias didn't stop running until his legs gave out beneath him. Deep in the forest, breath ragged, heart threatening to break his ribs, he collapsed against the base of an old pine. The sky above was hidden by thick branches, and the only sound was the low hum of insects and the wind through the leaves. The leather-bound book, the cursed book of laws, was still clutched to his chest. He laid it down on the mossy ground beside him, staring at it like it might spring to life and bite. The cover bore no title, no author, only faint claw-like markings in the leather, as if something had once tried to escape from within. He didn't dare open it again, just yet. The things he had read still echoed in his mind. Laws that twisted logic, punished kindness, and buried truth under layers of silence. It was almost morning when he finally forced himself to his feet. His shoulder ached from the fall, and the gash along his forearm stung, but there was no time to rest. He knew the order would come for him. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Tonight. If they were willing to take Marta, Alina, and the steward, they would not hesitate to erase him too. Elias needed to go farther. Not just to hide, but to expose the truth. By noon, he reached the river that marked the edge of the Baron's domain. Across it lay another village, Brookfin, a place that once had its own strange rules but had pushed back decades ago. People there remembered what it meant to resist. If he could get there, find someone who knew about the order, someone with power, with influence, maybe, just maybe, he could bring this whole house of lies crashing down. He wrapped the book in cloth and tied it tightly to his back, then stepped into the river. The current was cold and fast, nearly pulling him under twice, but he kept his arms moving and his head high. He stumbled out the other side, soaked to the bone, lungs burning but alive. Brookfin greeted him with quiet suspicion. Strangers were rare here, and soaked ones even rarer. An old man named Hollis, who tended to goats near the edge of town, saw him first. "You running from something?" Hollis asked, his eyes narrowing beneath thick white brows. "I'm running from a lie," Elias answered simply. Hollis looked him up and down. "Then you're welcome. For now." Elias spent the night in a barn under dry straw, hidden from view. He waited until dark before unpacking the book again, lighting a small candle and flipping through its pages carefully. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe an author's name, a clue to its origins, or some weak point in the madness that could unravel the whole thing. But then he saw it, a map, crudely drawn, tucked near the final pages. Not a map of the land, but of power. Circles representing villages. Lines of influence. Symbols marking where the order had touched. His own village was there. So was Brookfen. And one other place, Blackmere Abbey. The ink used to mark it was different, darker, almost oily. And next to it, one word in the same jagged script. Root. The root of it all. The beginning. Elias barely slept. By morning, he had a new destination. But he couldn't go alone. Not this time. He asked around cautiously, choosing his words with care. He spoke of unfair laws, of silence and fear. And slowly, carefully, people began to respond. A woman named Corin, who once studied with a scribe before the library burned down, agreed to help him read some of the more cryptic markings. A young blacksmith named Dirin, tall and silent, but with eyes full of fire, offered his horse. And Hollis, despite his age, handed Elias a wrapped package, dried food, a small dagger, and a small silver pendant marked with a strange symbol. "This used to mean freedom," Hollis said. "Wore it when I was younger, when we fought our own battles here. Don't know if it'll help now, but wear it anyway." They set out that evening, Elias and Corin riding together on Dirin's old gray mare. The path to Blackmere Abbey wound through deep woods and abandoned farmland, past places forgotten by time. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world became. Even the birds seemed to avoid the path ahead. On the third night, they found a broken milestone half buried in weeds. The inscription was nearly gone, but Corin rubbed charcoal across it and read the faint letters aloud. Asterisk, blessed be those who do not question. Asterisk. Elias stared at the words. They left warnings even in the stones. Or reminders, Corin whispered, to scare people into forgetting. By the time they reached the edge of the abbey's grounds, the sun had disappeared behind a thick wall of clouds. Blackmere stood like a corpse among trees, half ruined, its walls cracked and blackened with soot. Ivy clung to every stone, and the great bell tower leaned as if whispering secrets to the forest. "We should wait until morning," Corin said. "No," Elias replied. "If they know we're coming, they'll be ready. Now is better." The front doors groaned open with a single push. Inside, dust filled the air. Statues of saints lined the walls, many broken or defaced. And at the far end of the main hall, behind the shattered altar, stood a door made of ironwood, marked with the same thorn circle that haunted Elias's dreams. They approached slowly. No torches, no sound, just their own footsteps echoing like thunder in the silence. Elias placed a hand on the door. It was warm. He turned to Corin. "If something happens to me, we go together," she said firmly. He pushed it open. Inside was a long, narrow chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it, another book, twin to the one Elias carried, but older, its pages yellowed and cracked. Around it stood 5 robed figures, faces hidden in shadow. Each wore a black glove on one hand. None spoke. Elias stepped forward. "I know who you are. I know what you've done." One of the figures raised its head. The face beneath the hood was not cruel or twisted, but calm, pale, almost kind. "We are not monsters," the figure said. "We are guardians." "Of lies," Elias replied. "Of order," the figure corrected. "You think you want freedom, but freedom without guidance breeds fire. Chaos. We give the people rules. Certainty. Protection. You give them fear, Corin snapped. The figure didn't flinch. Fear is a teacher. Elias stepped closer, setting his book on the pedestal beside the other. Then let them read for themselves. Let them choose what to believe. The room grew still. Another figure, voice brittle and sharp, spoke. That book is a seed. You plant it in their minds, and it will grow. Grow until they burn their kings. Until they tear down their churches. Until there is nothing but blood and questions. Elias stared at them. Then maybe that's better than silence. The room darkened, as if the shadows themselves thickened. The first figure stepped back. So be it. Suddenly, the candles along the walls flared with green flame. The ironwood door slammed shut behind them. The ground trembled beneath their feet. And Elias realized he had started something he might not be able to stop. Not now. Not ever. Elias had never seen flames like that. Green, flickering low and strange, casting shadows that danced across the stone walls like figures trying to escape. The 5 robed figures didn't move. They just stood there, their faces hidden, silent as if they were waiting for something. The 2 books sat side by side on the pedestal, heavy and still, as if daring him to touch them again. Elias felt Corin's hand tighten around his arm. Even Durin, who hadn't said much during the journey, stood stiff behind them, eyes locked on the strange fire that now lit the chamber. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the robed figures, the one with the soft voice from earlier, stepped forward and looked at Elias directly. "You don't know what you carry," he said, his voice steady, but no longer calm. "That book has broken kingdoms. It has sparked rebellions and crushed them. And it was never meant for hands like yours." Elias didn't look away. "Then whose hands is it meant for? Yours? The ones who decide which dreams are punishable and which shoes are allowed." The man's had shifted slightly. It was meant for those strong enough to bear the burden of silence. Corin stepped in front of Elias. "That's not strength. That's fear dressed up as wisdom." Another of the robed figures stirred, her voice sharp and colder. "Fear protects. People want answers, but not all questions deserve them. You speak of freedom, but freedom is dangerous. It invites doubt. Doubt spreads faster than disease." Elias felt anger building in his chest, but it wasn't just anger. It was grief for the friends who had vanished, for the villagers who walked on eggshells every day, for all the people punished not because they did wrong, but because they didn't understand what rule they had broken. "I saw the list," Elias said quietly. "In the book. The names. Mine was there. Others too. You've been keeping track. Planning." "You misunderstand," the first man said. "We don't punish to destroy. We correct. We preserve what is fragile. Order. Structure. Without it, people fall into madness." "Then why hide?" Elias asked. "Why use old churches and forgotten symbols if you truly believe in what you're doing?" The man was silent. Outside, a sudden gust of wind howled against the stone, as if the world itself had heard the conversation and decided to join in. The green flames flickered wildly, and for a moment the shadows of the robed figures stretched unnaturally long, their shapes bending and warping as though they didn't quite belong to this world. Durin finally spoke, his voice low. "What is this place? What is this room?" The soft-voiced man turned his gaze toward the walls. "This was once a hall of reflection, before the wars, before the fires. Here, laws were not passed, they were questioned. That was our greatest mistake." Corin looked confused. "What do you mean?" "We opened the door too wide," he said. "We let people believe that every rule could be broken, that all truth was optional. It began with a single village, then a county, then an entire region burned itself down, trying to escape rules it didn't like. But these laws," Elias said, gesturing toward the books, "they're not real. They're nonsense. Why would anyone follow them?" "Because someone told them to," the man replied. "And because fear makes fools out of all of us." Elias took a step forward. "Then maybe it's time people stop listening to fear." The robed woman snapped her head up. "And what will they listen to instead? You? Some farmer's son with a hunger for justice? You think a little truth will heal a world built on superstition and obedience?" Corin answered before Elias could. "Maybe not all at once. But truth spreads too. Just like fear, one person tells another, and another, until people remember how to think for themselves again. The woman scoffed, stepping back into the shadows. Then a third figure spoke, this one older, voice rasping like leaves in the wind. You carry the second copy. You weren't supposed to find it. That version contains seeds we buried long ago, questions no one was meant to ask again. Elias felt a cold shiver run through his spine. What kind of seeds? The man's answer was slow. The kind that don't die. The kind that wait. Behind him, Diren shifted nervously. What do we do with it? Destroy it. The flames flared suddenly, and all 5 robed figures raised their heads at once. No, they said together. If you destroy it, it returns. If you hide it, it spreads. If you bury it, someone else will dig it up. Elias stared down at the book. Its leather cover looked even darker now in the strange light, almost pulsing. He didn't want to touch it again. He didn't want to read another word from it. But he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. He turned to Corin and Diren. We have to show people, not just this village. All of them. Let them read. Let them decide what kind of world they want. Diren looked uncertain. You really think they'll listen? Corin gave a faint, tired smile. Enough of them will. Elias took a deep breath, lifting the book from the pedestal again. The stone beneath it felt warm, like something had been burned into it over centuries. He wrapped the book tightly, placed it back in his pack, and looked up. Elias didn't move. Neither did Corin. The strange green light flickered across their faces, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the cracked stone walls. The 5 robed figures remained still around the pedestal, as if waiting for something, some sign, or permission from a voice neither Elias nor Corin could hear. The silence inside Blackmere Abbey felt heavier than the stones that held it up. Elias could hear his own breathing, shallow and fast. He glanced at Corin, whose hand had slid toward the small dagger at her side. She didn't draw it. Not yet. But her eyes were fixed on the figures with the kind of focus that comes from fear mixed with anger. Why now? Elias finally asked, his voice low. Why bring back these laws after all this time? The lead figure didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and placed a gloved hand on the older book lying on the pedestal. Because they never left, he said calmly. You call the forgotten laws, but forgetting is a choice people made. Not truth, not reality. These laws were carved into the bones of our world, Elias. You and your kind merely buried them in shallow graves. Elias narrowed his eyes. My kind, those who think the world can survive without boundaries, without structure, without pain. The man's tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even cruel. It was cold, like a teacher scolding a child for coloring outside the lines. When the plague came, the figure continued. People turned to chaos. When kings fell, and churches burned, and markets rotted, people looked for someone to blame. And when they found no answers, they turned to the old ways. Corin stepped forward. Your old ways are the reason so many suffered. People were punished for dreaming, for walking the wrong road, for humming the wrong tune. You call it structure. I call it terror. Another figure spoke. This one's voice was higher, sharp like broken glass. The terror kept them safe. And when they obeyed, they lived longer than those who didn't. Elias shook his head. People didn't live. They survived. Barely. Under fear. Under silence. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if the abbey itself didn't approve of these words. The flames flared again, licking at the edges of the old stones. The second book, the one Elias had carried from the steward's tower, vibrated slightly on the pedestal beside its older twin. Corin leaned close to Elias. They're not just preserving these laws, she whispered. They're feeding them. Somehow, Elias understood what she meant. These weren't just books. They weren't just rules. The order had built a system where belief itself gave the laws power. The more people obeyed, even out of fear, the stronger the laws became. And the more those laws took root, the harder they became to question. One of the figures stepped forward, revealing part of his face beneath the hood. His features were weathered but intelligent, eyes sharp, mouth tight. Do you know what fear really is, Elias? It's not weakness. It's instinct. The body's reminder that you're alive. We don't use fear to destroy. We use it to remind people that they belong to something greater than themselves. Elias said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. Inside, he felt the stirrings of something dark, rage maybe, or a memory of the people who had vanished because of these so-called reminders. Marta, Alina, the steward, faces blurred by time, but made clear again in the firelight. Corin raised her chin. And what happens when someone resists? What happens when a village refuses to follow your rules? The figure's eyes met hers. Then we begin again. A sick feeling twisted in Elias's stomach. The silence wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon. If anyone spoke out, the order wiped the slate clean. Started over. Made the people forget. Or worse, made them disappear. He glanced at the book again. Both books, side by side, pulsing with some hidden energy. They didn't just hold laws. They held control, woven through with lies disguised as commandments. Commands written in crooked ink, built on centuries of superstition and secrecy. Corin whispered again, "If we destroy the books, they'll kill us before we touch them," Elias muttered. "But they fear something," she said. "They wouldn't surround the books with flames and robes if they weren't afraid of someone learning the truth." She was right. Fear didn't just live among the villagers. It lived here too, in this abbey, in this room, behind every word the order spoke. These people weren't just guarding the laws. They were hiding behind them. The lead figure raised his hand, and the green flames dimmed slightly. The tension shifted in the room. Something was coming. "You've crossed into sacred ground," he said. "You've touched what was never meant for your hands. But you still have a choice, Elias. Return to your village. Tell them you were mistaken. Burn the copy you stole. And this ends. No more names added. No more disappearances." Elias stared at him. "And if I don't, then the law will follow you," the figure said. "Wherever you go." Corin's voice cut through the thick air. "You've already failed. People are beginning to notice. The laws are too strange. The rules don't make sense anymore." "That's the point," one of the other robed men said, his voice now trembling with something almost like glee. "When reason dies, obedience becomes the only choice." Elias couldn't take it anymore. "Then I choose not to obey." The green flames surged in protest. The old book snapped shut on its own, a loud crack echoing through the hall like thunder. The air grew bitter and cold. Elias grabbed Corin's hand. "We need to leave," he said quickly. "Now." But the robed figures blocked the door. The room began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling. Something ancient had been awakened, something that didn't like being questioned. Corin pulled a pouch from her belt and tossed its contents at the nearest figure. Crushed chalk, salt, and ash. The figure reeled back with a scream, clutching at his hood. A small opening cleared, and they ran. Elias didn't look back. He didn't want to see what followed. They ran through the abbey's halls, corridors shifting with smoke and shadow. The walls seemed alive, whispering in tongues neither of them understood. Corin shouted directions, her voice the only anchor in the chaos. By the time they burst into the night air, the abbey behind them was glowing with unnatural light. The great bell, which hadn't rung in decades, let out a single, deep toll that echoed across the trees like a warning. They didn't stop until the abbey was a distant smudge on the horizon. Breathless and shaken, Elias collapsed beside a fallen tree. Corin knelt beside him, hands still gripping the dagger. "What now?" she asked. Elias stared into the trees. His heart pounded, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. "Now we find others," he said. "People willing to listen, to fight back. The laws may be ancient, but they were written by people, which means people can break them." Corin nodded slowly. "And the books? We'll deal with them," Elias said, though he wasn't yet sure how. Behind them, in the far distance, the abbey still pulsed with green light. The order had shown their hand, and now Elias knew what he was truly up against. But something still didn't sit right with him, something buried in the pages, something he hadn't read yet. He reached for the book again, and deep within, between two stuck pages, he found a hidden message scrawled in faded ink. "There's a third book." And just like that, the mystery deepened. The laws weren't finished, and the worst might still be unwritten. The further Marcus and Brother Auric traveled, the stranger the laws seemed to get. In one small village tucked beneath the shadow of crumbling hills, they came across a sign nailed to a crooked post at the village entrance. It read, "By order of Lord Bertwald, no man shall whistle after dusk, punishable by stocks." Marcus squinted, wondering if it was a joke. But no one was laughing. In fact, as the sun lowered behind the hills, a tense hush fell across the cottages, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Brother Alric explained in a whisper that the villagers believed whistling at night invited spirits. It was an old superstition, but one the local lord had turned into law after claiming his barn was cursed by ghostly sounds. The penalty wasn't severe, but the idea of enforcing fear like this disturbed Marcus. He noticed how weary the people looked, children who barely smiled, and adults who avoided eye contact altogether. Fear was thick in the air, not of ghosts, but of authority. They spent that evening in the home of a kind widow named Hilda. She served them a thin broth and a stale loaf of bread, apologizing as if it were a grand feast. As they sat near the hearth, she told them how Lord Bertwald had once fined her for hanging her laundry on a Wednesday, claiming it was a day sacred to quiet. She had never heard of such a rule before it was enforced. Now, she only washed clothes in secret. Marcus asked her gently why the villagers didn't protest or flee, but Hilda just gave a small smile. "Where will we go, lad? The next village may be worse. At least here we know the rules, even if they make no sense." That sentence stuck with Marcus as they left the next morning. At least here we know the rules. There was something chilling in how calmly she'd accepted a world so warped by power. He couldn't help but feel like he was slowly being drawn into that same acceptance. As the road stretched onward, more stories unfolded, each one more puzzling than the last. In another town, a notice was pinned outside the church doors. "It is forbidden for peasants to wear shoes with pointed toes." Brother Alric explained that this was a law passed in several regions to prevent lower classes from mimicking the nobility. It was fashion policing in its crudest form, but violating it could mean a fine or worse, public shaming. The next village forbade fishing on Mondays, unless it was done with a wooden spear and from a boat painted red. That law had come from a past dispute between rival fishing guilds, and even though those guilds no longer existed, the law remained. Locals didn't question it. They just repainted their boats or avoided fishing entirely. The strangest moment came when Marcus and Alric arrived in a foreside hamlet where, by decree, cats were not allowed to be kept as pets. The villagers, mostly elderly, whispered of an old priest who believed cats were linked to sorcery. Even though that priest had died decades earlier, the rule remained, passed from one scribe to another, never revisited, never questioned. Marcus began writing everything down in a small journal. He felt like he was slowly piecing together a pattern, though he didn't yet understand what it meant. It was more than just bizarre customs. It was a kind of quiet control, the shaping of people's daily lives by rules that didn't protect them, but restricted them. And the strangest part was how few people questioned any of it. They obeyed, they feared, and sometimes they even believed. At a rest stop by a dusty crossroads, Marcus finally asked Brother Alric something that had been bothering him for days. Why do the people follow these laws if they're so clearly wrong? The monk looked thoughtful. "Because not all prisons have walls," he said quietly. "Some are built from generations of silence, from fear passed down like heirlooms, and from rulers who confuse obedience with virtue." That night, Marcus barely slept. His dreams were filled with faceless judges reading laws in strange languages and villagers marching in circles, bound by invisible chains. He awoke with a strange sense of urgency, though he didn't yet know what he needed to do. Their journey eventually brought them to the old city of Greswick, once the heart of regional trade, now quieter, grayer, but still important. It was here, in the musty archives of the Abbey, that Marcus began finding connections. Laws scrawled on parchment in fading ink. Decrees stamped by long-dead nobles. Revisions made hastily in the margins. It became clear that many of the laws still in effect across the countryside were never intended to last. Some were passed during times of crisis, others born from petty disputes or even miscommunication. One law had been meant to last only a single week during a bread shortage, but was never officially repealed. Another forbade riding donkeys near the river, based on a misread Latin phrase that originally referred to military crossings. But the most disturbing discovery came from a letter tucked between old tax records. It was written by a minor noble and addressed to a regional lord. We must keep the villagers busy with rules. The less they question, the less they rebel. Let them argue about socks and spoons, and they will not notice the gold missing from their taxes. Marcus stared at the letter, heart pounding. It was small, almost dismissible, but it echoed everything he had been feeling. These laws weren't just relics. Some had been crafted with intent, to control, to confuse, to distract. Brother Alric said nothing at first, only nodding when Marcus showed him. "Now you understand why I brought you," he said. "Not to learn the laws, but to see the sickness in them." The deeper they dug into the records, the clearer the pattern became. Some lords had even competed with each other, drafting ever more absurd laws as signs of power and pride. One claimed to outlaw clouds. Another required every home to hang a shoe above the door on Sundays. But there was one law Marcus couldn't find in the records, one that several villagers had whispered about, but always changed the subject afterward. It was called the Silence Act, and no one knew exactly what it said. Only that once a year, certain families were summoned to a hidden chamber beneath the castle of Eldmere, and after that, they never spoke of it again. Marcus felt a chill every time he heard the name Eldmere. Brother Alric refused to discuss it, only saying, "That place is where questions go to die." And yet, that's where they were headed next. The road to Eldmere was long and rough, and the villagers along the way grew quieter the closer they came. At the last and before the castle hills, a man in his 60s pulled Marcus aside as he was washing his hands. "If you go there," the man said quietly, "don't look at the statue in the courtyard. And if they ask your name more than once, don't answer the second time." Marcus asked what that meant, but the man only shook his head and walked away. That night, even the fire felt colder. The innkeeper refused to speak of the castle, though Marcus noticed him tracing a circle over his heart when he thought no one was looking. By morning, fog had swallowed the road ahead. The castle's towers were hidden in the gray mist, like the jagged teeth of a sleeping beast. Brother Alric packed in silence. Marcus could feel something shifting inside him, a mix of fear, curiosity, and something else. Resolve, perhaps. Whatever they found in Eldmere, he had to know. He had to understand how a world could be shaped by rules so strange, so specific, and yet so unquestioned. The silence of the fog seemed to press tighter with every step toward the castle gates. And somewhere beyond the mist, beyond the whispers, the truth was waiting, quiet, hidden, and dangerous. In the flickering firelight of a small village near the Danube, an old woman named Marta sat hunched over her spinning wheel. Her fingers moved slowly, more out of memory than strength, as she hummed a tune passed down from her grandmother. Outside, the cold mist wrapped around the wooden cottages like a warning. Marta had lived through 7 decades of strange laws and stranger punishments. She had seen boys fined for whistling after dusk and women publicly shamed for baking bread on the wrong day of the week. But even in her long memory, nothing quite matched the unease that had begun to settle over the countryside this past year. Word had spread of a royal decree that was baffling even the local barons. A man could be fined for dreaming of rebellion, not plotting it, not speaking it, just dreaming it. The church claimed the law was spiritual in nature, a preventative measure blessed by the Pope himself. But villagers whispered that the nobleman had simply grown paranoid. After all, how could anyone prove what went on in someone's dreams? That was the point. They couldn't, and that made everyone a suspect. By the castle walls of a larger town called Brechwald, a young scribe named Tomas tried to keep his head low. He was quiet by nature, more interested in ink and parchment than swords and spears. But lately, his work had taken a darker turn. He was tasked with recording confessions, some real, some forced. These were the direct results of the new dream law. Local authorities insisted the transcripts be neat and legible. Whether the statements were true or not didn't matter as much as whether they were complete. One night, Tomas sat alone in the archives, listening to the howling wind outside. He looked down at a confession signed just hours earlier by a farmer named Peter. It read, "I dreamt of my Lord's death. It was not my wish, only what I saw." Peter's hand had trembled when writing it. The next morning, he was gone. Not executed, just gone. No trial. No explanation. Just a blank spot where a life had been. Tomas couldn't help but wonder who was next. He rubbed his tired eyes and noticed something odd about the confession. At the bottom of the page, barely visible, were the faint remains of another sentence, erased hastily, but still legible under candlelight. "The priest told me to write this." Tomas felt his blood run cold. It wasn't just the noblemen enforcing the laws. The clergy had their own hand in it, too. That changed everything. The church, which once protected the peasants from excessive taxes and cruel barons, now seemed entangled in the same web of suspicion and control. In a different part of the kingdom, a traveling herbalist named Elsbeth made her way from village to village, carrying small bottles of healing oils and bitter tonics. She knew the forests better than most, and that made her both valuable and feared. In the eyes of many, her knowledge skirted dangerously close to witchcraft. And according to one bizarre law still on the books, any woman found to command the behavior of animals through unnatural means could be tried without witness. Elsbeth had narrowly avoided such charges last autumn when a child claimed her cat could speak. She had laughed it off in public, but wept in private. She knew what happened to women who attracted too much attention. Her cousin, Annika, had been drowned in a river 6 winters ago for owning too many frogs. The official charge? Beast whispering. Now, as Elsbeth passed through the market square of a town called Reckenstad, she noticed a sign nailed to a post. It warned all townsfolk to report strange dreams, odd behavior, or herbs that smell unnatural. There was no signature, no seal, just the command. The air around the sign smelled of old parchment and damp stone. No one stood near it, but everyone read it. Back in Brechwald, Tomas found himself at a crossroads. He knew too much. He had seen too many confessions that didn't make sense, too many people vanish without record. He also knew that asking questions was risky. The last man to ask why confessions were being collected without trial had been arrested for fomenting fear in the hearts of lawful subjects. His name had been scratched from the town registry within a week. Still, Tomas couldn't ignore what he felt. He started to keep a private journal, written in code, hidden inside the spine of a false book in the scriptorium. Each night he added to it, tracking the names, the patterns, the dates. And with each entry, the list grew longer. One day, a page arrived by Raven, sealed with black wax. It contained only one sentence. Silence is safety. No signature. No explanation. Tomas burned it after reading, but couldn't erase the feeling that someone was watching him now. In the southern territories, far from the towns and courts, there lived a boy named Lucas who had never been taught to read or write. His family was poor, their home built of stone and hay. They followed the seasons and the livestock, obeying the old traditions. But even here, laws found their way in. A wandering official named Sir Ottfried came to their village with a stack of proclamations and a scroll of rules. One such law stated that anyone caught singing songs that referenced mythic beasts, saints not approved by Rome, or the turning of kings to wolves would be arrested for spreading heresy. Lucas, who only knew what his grandmother had taught him, hummed a tune one evening as he gathered firewood. The next day, Sir Ottfried questioned him. 2 days later, his grandmother was taken away, accused of passing forbidden knowledge. What Lucas didn't understand was how something as innocent as a lullaby could become a crime. But that was the world now. Words, dreams, plants, and songs. Everything held the potential to break a law. And the worst part? Most of the laws were too vague to understand, yet too real to ignore. As weeks turned to months, Tomas heard rumors of a secret gathering, a network of scribes, scholars, herbalists, and villagers who were documenting the strange laws and those affected by them. They called themselves the Recorders. No one knew where they met or how to reach them. only that they existed. Tomas wanted to believe it was true. He needed to believe it. One snowy morning, a message was left under his stool in the archives. It read, "We see you. Keep writing. The truth must outlive the law." It was unsigned like the others, but this time it gave him hope. He folded the message and tucked it into the hollow spine of his hidden journal. Outside, bells rang to signal a new law had been announced. Villagers gathered in the square, faces blank, waiting to hear what freedom would be taken next. Elsbeth, now in hiding after being accused again, this time for curing a baron's illegitimate daughter of a fever, prepared to flee to the woods. She would find safety in places where no scroll had yet arrived. But how long would it last? Lucas stared at the frozen river, wondering if his grandmother would ever return. He still hummed the song she taught him, only now he did it quietly, in his head, where no law could hear. And Tomas, pen in hand, kept writing, knowing that each word might one day become a map for someone else, someone lost in the maze of silence and control. But little did he know, the very law he was documenting next would threaten everything he'd written so far. And someone already knew. Every corner of medieval Europe carried its own strange laws, but some were not only odd, they were deeply personal. And as the story moved deeper into the lives of the people who had to live under them, you began to see just how twisted and surreal things could get when power, fear, and superstition ruled the world. It wasn't just the peasants who suffered under bizarre regulations. It was everyone. From the bakers who were required to sell their bread at a just price, regardless of how much their ingredients cost, to the nobles who were fined for wearing clothes that were too flashy for their rank. The medieval world was a place where your appearance could betray you. In some regions, a farmer could be punished for wearing a hat considered too fine for his station. It was believed that your clothing should reflect your place in the hierarchy. And if it didn't, it was considered deceitful. Martin, a humble shoemaker, found himself accused of violating a sumptuary law after selling a pair of well-made boots to a local baron servant. The servant had liked the boots so much, he'd given them to his lord. But once the baron was seen wearing them, town officials came knocking on Martin's door. They accused him of elevating a commoner's work beyond its station. Martin didn't understand what he had done wrong. He made boots, strong ones, honest ones, but they told him that his work had crossed an invisible line. The boots, apparently, had been too fine for someone of the baron's rank unless made by a sanctioned noble shoemaker. It made no sense, yet the fine nearly ruined him. He stopped crafting boots with fancy stitching or imported leather after that, even though people begged for them. Fear hung heavier than the leather hides in his workshop. But this wasn't just about class. Religion crept into every rule, twisting daily life into a maze of sacred restrictions. In some towns, it was illegal to eat meat on certain days, even if that was all a family had. Enforcement could be extreme. A widow named Alice was brought before the local council for serving salted pork to her children on a Friday. Her husband had died in the fields, and her pantry was bare. The fishmonger had raised his prices, and the salted pork was all she could offer. But no one cared. The priest said she'd violated divine law. Her neighbors whispered that sickness had come to their village because of her sin. She was forced to stand barefoot in the chapel courtyard during morning mass, holding the slab of pork as punishment. Her children watched, confused and shivering in the cold, while others spit at her feet. The meat was later burned in front of the crowd, as if to purify the air. That evening, Alice didn't go home. No one saw her for weeks. Rumors spread that she had walked into the forest, seeking forgiveness where the laws of man couldn't follow. Laws didn't just control what people wore or ate. They governed movement, marriage, and even silence. In certain areas, it was forbidden for women to speak publicly in markets if their husbands were present. A woman named Marjorie had lived her whole life helping run her family's stall. She knew prices better than her husband did, knew how to haggle, knew the customers. But one day, when a visiting bishop passed through and saw her conducting business with a merchant, she was summoned. They accused her of unseemly conduct. Her husband, ashamed, was forced to pay a fine and publicly declare that he had lost control of his household. Marjorie wasn't punished by the law alone. Her husband banned her from returning to the stall. She stayed home after that, bitter and bored, listening to him bungle prices and lose customers. Their income dropped. Still, the bishop praised the household for returning to godly order. All Marjorie could do was watch through the shutters, her knowledge locked behind silent lips. Yet while these stories painted a bleak picture, there were others that revealed how people quietly resisted. A secret network of women known as the Midnight Stitchers helped each other bypass the sumptuary laws. They sewed hidden linings into dresses, added forbidden dyes to cloaks under cover of darkness, and exchanged cloth that could not be legally sold. These women didn't want to overthrow the system. They just wanted to feel a bit of beauty again, something of their own. They met in cellars, under bakeries, or behind abbey gardens. They whispered secrets about patterns and hidden meanings in embroidery. A red thread meant freedom. A green stitch near the hem meant a child had been saved from a law. It was a quiet rebellion, not violent but defiant. They knew the risks. Some had been caught, their work ripped apart in front of them, their fingers broken. But still they stitched. Meanwhile, the church's influence deepened. In places like Avignon and Cologne, religious leaders used strange laws to control not just morality, but thought. Books had to be copied by approved scribes. Telling stories about dreams could be considered dangerous, especially if the dreams questioned authority or divine order. A scholar named Jaron had spent years collecting stories from peasants about visions they claimed to have during plagues or storms. He believed they revealed truths about human fear and resilience. But when word spread that he had recorded a dream where a poor man walked into heaven while nobles were turned away, the local archdeacon ordered his work seized. Jaron's house was raided. The scrolls were burned in a courtyard while monks chanted prayers over the smoke. Jaron was not jailed, but he was banished from every library in the region. His name was scratched from the scholars' register. Still, he continued collecting stories. But now, he wrote them in the margins of discarded cookbooks and herbal manuals, hiding meaning between recipes. In another village, laws dictated the weight of bread and the penalty for undermeasuring it. A baker named Etienne was accused of making loaves too light. His scale, he swore, had broken in the storm. He had no intention to cheat anyone. But justice was swift and theatrical. They dragged him to the square, tied his hands, and made him carry a sack of stale bread on his back for 2 miles while children mocked him. His shop closed days later. His family left town. The law was supposed to ensure fairness, but it was rarely fair. And often, the punishments weren't about correction. They were about humiliation. Public shame became a tool. Stocks, pillories, forced declarations, or bizarre walking sentences meant to degrade someone while others watched. And as the story wound deeper through these human experiences, you realize that these weren't just strange laws. They were systems of control built into everyday life. But the question still lingered. Who benefited from these laws, and who truly enforced them? It wasn't always the church or the crown. In many cases, it was neighbors, family members, or old rivals who reported each other. A cobbler could accuse a butcher of using too much salt just to eliminate competition. A brother might whisper that his sister had sewn gold thread into a tunic meant for linen. Fear bred silence, and silence kept the machine running. And then, in a quiet hamlet near the coast, an old document was found buried beneath a collapsed stone wall. It was fragile, written in Latin, and sealed with wax. The man who discovered it was just a mason. He didn't read, didn't understand the symbols, but he took it to the priest. Within a week, the priest disappeared. So did the document. No one spoke of it again, but the mason swore it had been a law, one that had never been enforced, never even known. And whatever was in it, someone didn't want it read. The strange laws of medieval Europe were more than curiosities. They were weapons. They were mirrors. And some of them, perhaps, still linger, hidden in habits, in rituals, in the quiet ways people judge each other today. But back then, no one could have imagined just how far the grip of these strange, twisted rules would reach. And something was coming, something bigger, a whisper spreading through the old towns. carried in rumors and old songs about a forgotten law, a hidden truth, and the punishment for uncovering it. The narrow, cobbled road twisted through the forest like a ribbon tied in haste. Alaric trudged silently, his boots heavy with the mud of the last village. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows that moved like whispering ghosts. He had hoped to find answers in Raventon, a market town known for its strict adherence to the old laws, but instead he found silence and locked lips. No one there would speak of the law scrolls that once lined the town hall. No one mentioned the missing reeve. And yet, everyone knew something. That much was clear in the way they lowered their gaze, or changed the subject the moment Alaric mentioned the year of Ash, the time the crown had passed new laws so bizarre, entire villages were erased for breaking them. He recalled the baker who had been exiled not for theft or treason, but for baking loaves in a round shape rather than square. To mimic the Holy Sun is to mock the church, the decree had read. And so he was marched out by armed clergy, never to be seen again. In Raventon, Alaric had found a carving behind the church altar, an old image of bread, but scorched and crossed out. It wasn't about bread, of course. It was about control, and someone, somewhere, had wanted that symbol erased. As he pressed on toward the next hamlet, dusk gave way to night. The stars blinked into view one by one. This stretch of land was once part of the Crown Forest, where no man could pick a flower, gather wood, or even walk without permission. It was still a crime to kill a deer here, under laws that remained unrevoked for over a century. Though no guards were posted anymore, old fear lingered in the wind. Alaric heard it in the rustle of branches and the distant howl of a lone wolf. He came upon a small stone bridge and paused. Beneath it, the shallow river trickled along lazily, unaware of the secrets buried in its silt. There were stories told of this place, of men who were tried for witchcraft simply for knowing how to swim. Drowning had been considered divine judgment, and survival was proof of guilt. It was nonsense, of course, but such nonsense had shaped lives, destroyed them even. A fire glowed faintly up the path. A small camp, maybe. Alaric approached cautiously. Two men sat near the flames, dressed in rough wool and leather. One noticed him first and raised a hand. "You're walking late," the man said, his voice hoarse but not unkind. "I've walked later," Alaric replied. "Then you've seen things." The second man said it not as a question, but as a truth. "I'm looking for answers. About the old laws. The ones people are too afraid to name." Both men looked at each other. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Finally, the first one gestured for him to sit. People don't talk about them because they were written in blood, not ink. And not all of them were erased. Alaric sat, grateful for the warmth. But why? Why pass such strange laws in the first place? Why ban laughter on Tuesdays or require candles to be burned in pairs? To keep people busy, to make them afraid of every small thing. A mind kept in fear doesn't wander into rebellion. The second man leaned closer. "There's a ledger in Black Hollow, an abbey. They say it holds copies of laws that were never meant for the public to see. Secret ones, only used when needed. You want answers? That's where they start. Black Hollow." Alaric frowned. "It's abandoned, only above ground," the man said, and then fell quiet again. Alaric slept uneasily beside them, haunted by the thought of laws that still breathed beneath the surface of daily life. Unspoken, unnamed, but enforced by fear and habit. The next day, he set off at dawn, the directions etched roughly on a strip of bark handed to him by the firelight stranger. Black Hollow was half a day's journey, tucked behind a ridge and nearly swallowed by forest. As he approached, the trees thickened unnaturally. He passed signs scorched into bark, an X over a candle, a star with a line through it. He didn't recognize the symbols, but they made his skin crawl. Something about the air shifted. Even the birds had gone silent. The abbey appeared suddenly, its stone walls crumbling but still defiant. Ivy crept up its sides like veins, and the once grand doors hung open. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and wax. Alaric walked carefully, scanning the walls for hidden passageways. He recalled the man's words, only above ground. Somewhere here, there had to be a way down. Near the altar, he found a broken slab, slightly raised. He pulled it free, revealing steps that descended into blackness. Lighting a small lantern, he moved slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, the passage opened into a hall of shelves and scrolls. Dust danced in the lamplight. Alaric's fingers traced the bindings, parchment brittle with age, yet intact. The first scroll he opened detailed punishments for disruptive laughter during sermons. Another outlined how any woman with more than 3 cats was presumed to be a whisperer of demons. Each law was signed not by a monarch or noble, but by initials, DL or SV, over and over again. He dug deeper, until he found one sealed with red wax, unbroken. He hesitated, then cracked it open. Inside was a law he'd never heard of, one that chilled him to his core. Any who seeks to rewrite or erase these laws shall be declared enemy of the realm, and their names struck from time. The ink was fresh. Fresh! Alaric froze. That wasn't possible. A sound echoed behind him, a faint scrape of movement. He turned. Nothing. But the tension in the air thickened, like something ancient had just awakened. He backed away slowly, scroll in hand, and made his way back up into the abbey. Outside, the wind howled louder than before, whipping through the trees as though warning him. Back on the road, he realized something else. His name, the one he had carved on a stone marker by his family's land weeks ago, it was gone. The marker was still there, but the name was not. Alaric. Vanished. He felt a weight pressed down on him. Somewhere, someone, or something was watching. He didn't just read about forbidden laws. He had broken one, and now the law was watching him. In the gray haze of dawn, as the chill clung to the cobblestones like secrets too heavy to lift, Brother Anselm stood in the empty chapel of St. Brigid's, fingers tightly curled around a scroll too ancient for comfort. The flicker of candlelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows behind the stone pillars. He had uncovered something buried deep in the monastery's vault beneath layers of dust, rat droppings, and forgotten warnings. It wasn't just a list of strange laws. It was a record of why they were created, and worse, who had enforced them. In the soft silence, he could hear the town waking. Carts creaked in the distance. A rooster called out hoarsely, and somewhere beyond the stained glass windows, a child began to cry. But the air inside the chapel was thick with questions. The scroll was real. The names it were real too. Some had been marked with red wax seals. Others crossed out entirely. There were notes scribbled in the margins by different hands over centuries. Laws that punished women for weeping in public. Rules banning singing past sunset. And edicts demanding the exhumation of bodies on suspicion of posthumous treason. It sounded absurd, even comical, but Anselm's hands trembled. Because near the bottom of the scroll was a name he knew, a name from just 2 days ago. Lady Celine. She had been the one to confront the elders at the council meeting, quietly but firmly questioning why the village still obeyed a code written hundreds of years ago. She had asked why the bridge toll tripled on cloudy days. Why widows were forbidden from wearing blue on market days. Why a man had been punished for harvesting more than 3 turnips in one evening. And she'd laughed, too boldly, perhaps, when someone tried to quote the Book of Penitent Order to silence her. That laughter had been her mistake. Now her name sat beneath the ink of centuries. Marked. Across the village square, Matthias the scribe coughed into his palm and shook his head as he recopied yet another page of law for the weekly board. He worked in the old booth under the bell tower, a place where parchment and ink had more power than swords. He'd grown up copying those rules, memorizing them before he could write his own name. But even he had begun to wonder why no one questioned the one that forced townsfolk to bow before the tax cart, or the one that forbade women from baking more than 2 loaves of bread during the full moon. And yet, no one ever rebelled. Because rebellion wasn't punished, it was erased. Quietly, discreetly, as if it had never existed. The baker's boy, Tomas, had once dared to skip the mandated Wednesday silence to whistle as he worked. No one had seen him since. Some said he ran off to join a band of outlaws. Others said he had been rehoused, a term people used with lowered voices. No one knew what it meant. No one dared to ask. And so the laws went on. Like ghosts, they drifted through everyday life, shaping behavior, curling around conversations. There was a law against leaving doors ajar past sunset, one that required villagers to stand still and face the castle at the tolling of the 8th hour. Children were taught these things before they were taught how to read. But few knew why, or who decided, or what happened to those who asked too many questions. Back in the chapel, Brother Anselm gently rolled up the scroll and slid it into the inner fold of his robes. There were markings in the margins he hadn't yet decoded, strange sigils, drawings that resembled constellations, and lines that may have been lyrics or incantations. It was all far too complicated, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just about old rules. Someone had maintained these laws, protected them, and punished anyone who dared disrupt them, and that someone might still be watching. He stepped outside, the cold morning biting his cheeks, and spotted Edric pacing near the well. The young apprentice had dark circles under his eyes and the look of someone who'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. When he noticed Anselm, he stiffened. "They took her," Edric said softly. "Lady Celine. Last night. For men. Red bands on their arms." Didn't say a word. Anselm closed his eyes. The scroll pulsed against his chest like a secret heartbeat. "Where did they take her?" Edric looked around, then leaned in. "North. Toward the ruins." No one went north. That was where the abandoned abbey lay, a place people whispered about but never named. According to old village tales, the abbey had been burned during the plague for harboring heretics. But those are just stories, weren't they? In the distance, the blacksmith's hammer rang out. Life continued, indifferent as always. Yet, underneath the surface of the daily rituals, bread baking, bells tolling, wool gathering, was an unease that hadn't been there before. People were beginning to question, even if only in private. And the laws, strange and rigid as they were, had started to tighten. The tax collector's visits had become more frequent. The council of elders had begun posting decrees in Latin again, though most couldn't read it. And a rumor had spread that a man had been fined for smiling at a goat. These weren't laws, they were tools. Tools for control. Tools that reshaped reality until no one could tell truth from tradition. Anselm and Edric made their way along the village edge, cloaks pulled tight against the wind. As they passed the statue of Saint Bourbon, Anselm noticed something carved freshly at its base. A single word, reviso. He frowned. That wasn't Latin. It was close, but not quite. A code? A warning? At the edge of the woods, where the old road forked, Edric stopped. "This is as far as I go," he said. "They say the road past this point listens and remembers." Anselm didn't laugh. He simply nodded. The scroll hidden under his robes had grown heavier. He turned down the overgrown path alone, the trees closing around him like cloaks of shadow. Every crunch of leaves underfoot felt like a question. Who made these laws? Why were they never revoked? And who was still enforcing them centuries later? The deeper he walked, the colder it became. Not just from the wind, but from something else. A presence. The path led him to the old ruins, crumbling walls now covered in moss, the stone chapel half swallowed by earth. And there, in the center, was something unexpected. Light. A single lantern flickered behind a broken window. He stepped closer, heart thudding, and then he saw her. Lady Celine, bound but alert, her eyes locked with his through the gap in the stone. Before he could move, a shadow crossed the doorway, and Anselm froze. A man in gray robes stepped into view, face hooded, but his voice rang clear and cold. "You brought the scroll." Anselm didn't answer. "Good," the figure said, stepping closer. "Then you're ready to learn why the laws cannot be broken." And the door creaked open. Anselm stepped inside. The wind had picked up in the village square, brushing dust and straw into tight little spirals that danced along the cobbled path. Hans stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching the town crier nail another parchment to the wooden board outside the church. His heart sank as the voice rang out across the square, loud and sharp. "By order of the Crown and Holy Church, all who harbor cats, owls, or ravens within their home shall be subject to inquiry for witchcraft and heresy. The murmur that followed was one of fear. No one questioned the law. Not here. Hans glanced at his sister, Greta, whose expression darkened with worry. They had taken in an injured barn owl just weeks ago. A harmless act, he thought. But in a world where strange laws ruled reason, even kindness could be twisted into suspicion. The owl, healed now, roost above their loft each night, a silent secret beneath their thatched roof. As the townsfolk began to disperse, whispering and glancing nervously at one another, Hans and Greta turned away without speaking. They walked in silence until they reached the hill behind their cottage. From there, you could see the village and the distant outline of the manor house, where Lord Beckhart lived. Rumors followed him like smoke from a dying fire. Some said he was the one behind the increasing number of strange decrees. Laws that made it illegal to wear shoes inside the church, unless you were born into nobility. Rules that forced bakers to bury leftover bread, so the dead might not go hungry in the afterlife. The list had grown longer, more absurd, and far more dangerous. Inside the cottage, Greta sat down and folded her hands. "They'll come here eventually. Someone will say something," she said quietly. Hans didn't respond. He was staring at the old book on their shelf, the one their father had kept hidden for years. It wasn't filled with spells or forbidden knowledge, just notes on old customs, forgotten traditions, the ways of their ancestors before the laws had changed everything. "Do you remember what Father used to say?" Greta asked. "That the laws didn't always make sense, but people followed them anyway because they were afraid." Hans nodded. Afraid of being different. Afraid of being seen. The barn owl landed softly on the rafters above them, and Greta looked up. "If they find her here," Hans clenched his jaw. "They won't. We'll take her to the old tower near the wood. It's abandoned. She'll be safe there." But that wasn't the only problem. Whispers were spreading about strange inspections, about young men disappearing from nearby villages, taken in the night for violating moral codes that no one remembered being passed. One boy had been seen wearing green stockings, an offense under the law of color and rank, which dictated that only clergy could wear green during Lent. Another had dared to sing a love ballad after sunset, violating the law of sacred silence. His family hadn't seen him since. Even as fear crept closer, life in the village continued. Markets opened. Bells rang. But there was a heaviness in the air, a stiffness in every movement, as if the townspeople were walking a narrow line between survival and suspicion. One evening, Hans visited old Marta, a woman who had lived through more seasons than anyone could count. Her hut sat at the edge of the woods, cluttered with dried herbs and cracked pottery. She was rumored to know the old ways, the real laws before the strange ones took hold. He brought her a small bag of flour and a few apples in trade. She nodded silently and gestured for him to sit. "I need to understand," Hans said, "why the laws keep changing, why they make no sense." Old Marta gave him a long look, then poured hot water over dried chamomile and set the cup in front of him. "Because nonsense is a weapon," she said. "When you confuse the people, you control them. When they live in fear of doing something wrong without even knowing what the rules are, they become easier to guide, easier to punish." Hans swallowed hard. "But who writes these laws?" Marta's fingers tapped on the rim of her cup. "Some say it's the king. Others say it's the church. But those are only shadows. There's someone else. Someone behind the curtain. Someone who benefits when the people suffer confusion." Greta joined him at Marta's the next day. Together, they learned of the law of holy time, which declared that time itself must be kept according to a system no one understood. Every 9th day, work was forbidden unless it was raining, in which case it was reversed. And the law of gesture, which banned waving at neighbors, lest it resemble a heretical symbol. Greta laughed at first. Then she realized Marta wasn't joking. "It's not the laws themselves," Marta said. "It's the way they're used. As traps. To catch the kind-hearted, the clever, the quiet. To weed out those who might ask questions." One stormy night, a cloaked rider arrived at the village. He wore no crest, but his horse was branded with the symbol of the king's inquisition. The villagers didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what his presence meant. The next day, 3 people were taken from their homes. One for humming a song in Latin, another for keeping bees too close to the chapel wall. The third, an old man who had once told stories of the forest spirits, was accused of memory against doctrine. Hans watched it happen from the shadows, fists clenched, heart pounding. Greta stood behind him, her voice low. "It's getting worse." He nodded slowly. "They're looking for something. Or someone." The laws, it seemed, were no longer just strange. They were becoming tools of a hunt. Late one evening, Greta found something beneath their floorboards. A parchment sealed in wax, stamped with the faded emblem of a forgotten guild, the Guild of Lorekeepers. It was addressed to their father. She read it aloud with shaking hands. "The records must be preserved. The true law cannot be forgotten. If you receive this, they have likely come for others. Hide the book. Pass on the truth in silence." Hans looked at her, stunned. So he knew. Greta nodded. He was one of them, a lorekeeper. That's why he hid the book. That's why he was taken. The pieces were coming together, but not fast enough. Someone knew about the book. Someone had seen the owl. And now, someone was watching them. From the top of the hill that night, Greta saw a figure near their cottage, a lantern flickering in the dark. She didn't speak. She simply gripped Hans's arm, and he understood. They were out of time, as the shadows closed in around them, and the laws grew more tangled and absurd. Hans and Greta knew the truth was no longer safe in their hands. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to pass it on. Somewhere out there, the guild might still exist. Someone might still be listening. But first, they had to survive the night. The knock on the wooden door echoed through the silent stone hallway. Father Bernard paused, candle in hand, unsure if he'd imagined the sound. The monastery had long been asleep, and any visitor at this hour was either desperate or dangerous. He hesitated for a moment, his breath catching in the cold, damp air before stepping toward the entrance. Outside stood a young woman cloaked in mud, her face hidden beneath a hood. "Your Father Bernard?" she whispered. The priest nodded, ushering her inside before anyone else could notice. She glanced around the chapel with frightened eyes. "I need sanctuary." In medieval Europe, sanctuary wasn't just a word. It was a desperate plea for protection, invoking centuries-old laws that said no one, not even the king's men, could see someone from within holy walls. The woman was trembling, her voice barely audible as she revealed her name. Eleanor, a commoner's daughter accused of violating a moral statute she claimed not to understand. She'd been charged under a local decency law that punished unmarried women for wearing frivolous colors in the marketplace. Blue, green, and gold were reserved for the nobility, she was told, and her simple linen dress, dyed with crushed herbs, had drawn attention she hadn't intended. But someone had reported her. The steward of the manor had taken it upon himself to make an example of her, and the village reeve had already sent men to seize her. The punishment was likely to involve public shaming, stocks, or worse. As Father Bernard lit another candle, his thoughts raced. The law she mentioned wasn't one Rome had sanctioned. This was one of those localized customs that had quietly flourished in the countryside, sometimes without anyone questioning its origin or fairness. That was the danger of these strange medieval laws. Many weren't written, only passed through whispers and enforced through fear. Bernard didn't want to break the rules, but lately, rules no longer felt holy. Meanwhile, across the village, the steward himself, a graying man named Lord Wulfric, received word that Eleanor had escaped. His jaw tightened, and he slammed his fist against the oaken table. "No one defies the law," he growled. He wasn't concerned about the color of a dress. He was concerned about order, the perception of control. Eleanor's small act was seen as a spark that could ignite unrest among peasants already uneasy with rising taxes and food shortages. If one peasant questioned a rule, others might too. That terrified men like Wulfric. Back in the monastery, Eleanor sat beside a small hearth as Father Bernard tended to her scraped hands. Her voice broke as she whispered, "All I did was wear a dress my mother made." There was no anger in her voice, only disbelief. She wasn't seeking rebellion. She wasn't even asking for justice. She just wanted someone to understand that she hadn't meant to challenge anything. Bernard listened carefully. He had heard whispers of these petty prosecutions before. Others jailed for gathering too much firewood or fined for baking bread with outlawed grains. Local lords used these rules to control behavior, mask economic stress, and justify harsh punishments. The church had once questioned them, but somewhere along the line, the protests faded. Bernard wondered if he, too, had been silent for too long. News of Eleanor's presence at the monastery spread faster than either of them expected. By morning, a group of armed riders approached the outer gate. Wulfric's men demanded her release, citing her violation of the sumptuary code of modest living, a law so vague it could be twisted to fit almost any case. The monks refused, but they knew violence might follow. Inside, Bernard wrestled with his own doubts. Offering sanctuary was noble in principle, but doing so now put every monk at risk. If the monastery was seen as defying the nobility, it could lose favor, funding, even protection. The bishop in the nearby city had recently warned them not to get involved in secular affairs. But Bernard had looked into Eleanor's eyes. She wasn't a rebel. She was a scapegoat. As tensions escalated, word reached a traveling magistrate named Thomas d'Artois, who had quietly been investigating abuses of local law in the region. Thomas had long been disturbed by how many lords weaponized obscure rules to maintain control. He traveled in disguise, gathering stories from villagers and monastics alike. When he heard of Eleanor's case, he made his way toward the monastery, hoping to intervene before matters escalated beyond repair. Along the road, he passed other signs of law gone mad. In one hamlet, he found a man punished for walking his oxen on Sunday, a supposed violation of the Sabbath. In another, a woman had been fined for singing too loudly in the fields, accused of disturbing the peace. These laws were never debated, never justified, and rarely recorded. They floated in a gray space between tradition and tyranny. By the time Thomas arrived at the monastery, a small standoff was underway. Lord Wulfric's men had circled the grounds, making veiled threats to the monks who stood silently at the gates. Eleanor stayed hidden, listening to every hoofbeat and murmured word. She knew she wasn't safe. Not really. Not yet. Thomas approached calmly, revealing his seal and title to the guard. Wulfric's expression soured. "This is not your affair," he snapped. Thomas disagreed. When a law is used to silence innocence and enforce fear, it becomes everyone's affair. Inside the monastery, Bernard watched from a narrow window. The presence of a royal magistrate changed the air. It was rare for one to show up in person, especially in a matter like this. But Thomas wasn't here by accident. He had seen too many victims of absurd regulations. Laws about clothing, bread sizes, even candle lengths, all used to divide and control. He requested to speak with Eleanor directly. When she sat across from him in the cold stone chamber, he simply asked, "Do you know why this law exists?" Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't even know it was one." Thomas nodded. "That's often the case. And yet it binds you, punishes you." He looked at Bernard. "How many others like her have you seen?" Bernard hesitated. "More than I can count. We stopped questioning them. We just adjusted." That answer haunted Thomas more than anything. Later that evening, under candlelight, he reviewed the surrounding village's common laws, compiled from old charters, verbal accounts, and peasant testimonies. It was worse than he feared. There were no standards. A lord could make a rule one morning and enforce it by sundown. And while some laws had roots in religious customs or Roman codes, many were simply power plays, meant to mark territory, humiliate dissenters, or prove dominance. He needed to bring this higher to the regional council. But doing so would provoke powerful men like Wulfric, and not everyone on the council valued fairness over order. He had to tread carefully. Meanwhile, Wulfric wasn't waiting. In the shadows, he instructed his captain to retrieve Eleanor if diplomacy failed. "Do it quietly," he said, "and make sure it looks like she ran." Eleanor, unaware of the plot forming outside, sat by the fire with Bernard, sharing a story from her childhood, a story about a field of lavender and her mother's laughter. She didn't talk about laws or fear, just memories. But every word struck Bernard deeper. He realized how much had been lost to fear, How many people like Eleanor had vanished beneath the weight of laws no one ever questioned? As the moon rose high and the wind howled through the monastery walls, a single thought echoed in Bernard's mind. What if sanctuary was no longer enough? And outside, under the cover of night, Wulfric's men began to move. As Brother Anselm's candle flickered against the damp stone walls of the scriptorium, the scratching of his quill slowed. His eyes, weary from decoding another passage of the king's decrees, paused on a new phrase, one he hadn't seen before. It was buried in the folds of Latin legal jargon, but its meaning was clear. Any subject caught mocking the church's rules on fasting days could be publicly dunked in freezing water, regardless of age or health. The monks used to copy such laws without question. But now, Anselm's hand hovered above the parchment, hesitating. He looked to his side, where Matilda sat in silence, sorting old manuscripts by candlelight. The young woman, once punished by the village bailiff for chewing mint leaves during Lent, now spent her days under Anselm's protection. Her knowledge of herbal medicine, passed down by her mother, had been labeled heathen. But it wasn't until the new judge, Sir Elric, arrived in the Shire that things truly took a dark turn. It was he who began enforcing these ancient and strange laws, not out of faith, but as a weapon of control. That very afternoon, Sir Elric had summoned another woman to the town square for punishment. Her crime? Hanging wet laundry on a Sunday. The villagers had whispered among themselves, wondering if this was truly divine law, or if something else was brewing behind Elric's sharp gaze and ceremonial robes. Every time someone questioned the law, another was made an example. Anselm began to suspect that not even the church fully sanctioned these rulings. One of his letters, sent to the diocese in Winchester, had vanished. Another returned, sealed with a wax crest he didn't recognize. And in the margins, written in rushed hand, was a warning: beware the black ledger. The laws you copy are not all holy. It was that phrase, black ledger, that began to spread through the quiet corners of the town. Old Jacob the carpenter claimed he had seen it once, years ago, when he was forced to build a traveling box of law for a nobleman's procession. It were no Bible, he muttered. It was full of rules nobody remembered agreeing to, made-up stuff, and those who questioned it, they never stayed around long. Matilda leaned closer to Anselm now, watching him frown. "Did you find something again?" she asked softly. Her voice carried the caution of someone who had already suffered too much from careless words. He nodded slowly. "Another law, one that punishes speech, not action, and it's older than any I've ever seen. But it wasn't written in the previous collection. It's as if someone slipped it in." She swallowed. "Like the others?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned the parchment and held it to the candle's flame. The ink shimmered oddly, glossier than usual. A smell, faint but distinct, wafted up. It wasn't regular ink. It had been mixed with bloodroot, an old trick from herbalists to make writing semi-invisible unless lit just right. That's when it clicked. Someone was embedding new laws into the old scrolls, making them appear ancient. It was forgery disguised as divine decree. The real fear wasn't just that Elric was enforcing unjust laws, but that someone higher up was fabricating them to create obedience. Across the village, Sir Elric stood in the watchtower, sipping wine from a goblet carved with the king's sigil. But unlike others, his bore an extra engraving, one that few noticed. A single eye carved above the crown. It was said to represent vigilance, but to the older villagers, it meant something else entirely: the eye of revision, the sign of those who rewrote history. His servant approached with a scroll. "Another copy from the abbey, my lord." Elric unfurled it quickly and smiled. "Good." The ink took. Let the fools believe it came from Rome. Below, the villagers gathered for yet another punishment. This time, it was a young boy caught wearing red shoes on the wrong feast day. Anselm, watching from afar, clenched his jaw. It was an absurd rule, but not without purpose. Red shoes were once a mark of noble blood, and someone was trying to erase that symbol from the commoners. By controlling how people dressed, ate, and even prayed, the law was reshaping the memory of the people. And just when Anselm thought it couldn't get stranger, a traveler arrived. Cloaked in dark wool, carrying a battered satchel, he went straight to the abbey's outer gate. Matilda saw him first, noticing the way he avoided the guards. He spoke a name, Brother Odo, and handed Anselm a sealed page. The wax was unlike any they had seen, black with silver threads. Inside was a single phrase: "The laws are not laws. They are warnings rewritten." No signature, no return message requested. Anselm and Matilda stared at each other, realization creeping in. What if these strange rules weren't designed to control, but to hide something, to prevent people from doing things that might lead to the truth? Why else would it be illegal to walk into the woods barefoot during the full moon? Or to hang garlic above your door unless it was a Thursday? Or to whistle inside a well? The laws weren't just arbitrary. They were diversions. And whoever wrote them knew something ancient, something they wanted to bury under centuries of fear and ritual. The second twist came late that night. The abbey bell rang 3 times. Not the hour, not a call to prayer, but a signal known only to a few elders. It meant one thing: a relic had been disturbed. Matilda rushed outside, barefoot, heart pounding. The villagers were gathering near the southern graveyard. A tomb had been opened, an old knight's, untouched for over 200 years. Inside, instead of bones, they found scrolls, dozens of them, bound with iron wire and sealed in glass tubes. Anselm arrived last, his eyes wide. He took one scroll gently and read just 2 lines before turning pale. "Let be known that the laws created by the High Council of Wessex were but veils to protect the doorway." Matilda whispered, "What doorway?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the woods beyond the church walls, the same woods banned by law since 1179. No villager had dared cross the marked boundary, fearing strange beasts or curses. But Anselm suddenly knew that's where the next truth lay. As rain began to fall and thunder rolled over the hills, the villagers looked between Anselm, Matilda, and the silent tomb now filled with forbidden words. The laws they had feared were no longer just cruel rules. They were warnings, and someone had been rewriting them to keep a secret buried. And the secret was starting to rise again. The moon rose high above the small village of St. Brook, casting a silver light over the cobblestone paths and narrow wooden homes. A cold wind rustled through the trees, stirring the worn banners that hung limply from the manor walls. Inside, the hall was quiet except for the crackle of the hearth. Brother Aldrich stood at the edge of the firelight, holding a yellowed parchment in his trembling hands. What he had discovered in the monastery's hidden cellar had unsettled him more than he dared admit. The scroll detailed a set of laws, forgotten, bizarre, and steeped in secrets no one in the village spoke of anymore. The deeper Aldrich read, the more disturbed he became. These weren't merely outdated customs. They were instructions, hidden rituals linked to land rights, family lineage, and even disappearances over the centuries. Strange laws like the Bell of Innocence, which had to be rung at midnight for a week if someone was accused of sorcery. Or the Trial of the 3 Winds, where a person had to face east, south, and north winds to prove their purity. If they sneezed during the ritual, they were deemed guilty. It sounded absurd, but these weren't legends. They were enforced centuries ago, and possibly still were in secret. Meanwhile, outside the village, Justine made her way through the woods with a lantern in hand. She had left her cousin asleep in the cottage and followed the direction Father Gervais had mentioned, toward the ruins of the old Gallows Hill, a place locals avoided after dusk. Something about the air changed as she crossed the invisible threshold where the forest thickened unnaturally. Her boots sank slightly into the mossy earth, and she noticed stone markers that didn't seem to belong to any known cemetery. Symbols were etched into them, symbols that matched the ones Aldrich had seen in the manuscript. Justine stopped when she spotted the remnants of a crumbling stone platform. At its center stood a post, blackened by time, with thick, rusted rings still attached. A strange object hung from one of the rings, a small wooden figure bound in twine, with one arm missing. Justine didn't touch it. Her breath caught in her throat when she noticed fresh footprints in the mud, much larger than her own, circling the gallows in a slow, deliberate path. Whoever had been here hadn't wanted to be seen, but they had left a mark. Back in the manor, Lord Giroux stared out the stained glass window of his study. His family had ruled this land for generations, and he knew every dark corner of its past. He had been taught, from a young age, that power was held not just by sword and coin, but by understanding the laws that others had long buried. The blood bell, for instance, was one such law. A noble could call it into effect if a peasant family crossed on a church land without offering a blessing. The penalty, carried out quietly, had always involved disappearance rather than punishment. He had hoped such laws would die with his father. But things were changing. Outsiders were asking questions. And now, the old bell had rung again last night, despite no one living daring to pull its cord. Giroux turned to the steward. "You said the monk saw the bell swinging?" "Yes, my lord. Brother Aldrich saw it from the library window. Said it stopped the moment he looked." The lord nodded slowly. "Then someone is invoking the old code. What should we do?" "Let it play out." Those who dig in the past tend to get buried by it, unaware of the tension unfolding elsewhere. Justine had returned to the village with a sketch of the wooden figure and symbols from the stone markers. She met Brother Aldrich early the next morning, and the two huddled in the candlelit back room of the chapel, whispering like conspirators. Aldrich's hands trembled as he matched one of the etchings to an image from the ancient scroll. "This is the mark of the law of unburdening," he explained. "It was used when someone of noble blood committed an offense they didn't want on record. They would select a villager to symbolically carry the guilt and then disappear them. The noble's name would be cleared, and the villager's memory erased." "Erased?" Justine asked, confused. "Literally. Families told to forget. Records removed. And if anyone asked too many questions, they'd vanish too." The implications were horrifying, but Justine wasn't surprised. She'd heard hushed stories growing up, of great-aunts who simply never came home, of strangers who left behind locked doors and empty fields. The law was like a shadow. You didn't see it, but you knew when it passed over you. "Do you think it's still being practiced?" she asked. Aldrich hesitated. "I think someone is trying to bring it back." Justine leaned closer. "Who?" Before he could answer, the chapel door creaked open. They fell silent. A figure stepped in from the mist outside. A woman, older, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak with eyes as sharp as frost. Her name was Bernadette, the village herbalist. But some whispered she was something more. "I heard the bell too," she said quietly, "and I know what it means." They let her in. She closed the door behind her and laid a bundle on the table. Inside was another wooden figure, similar to the one Justine found at the gallows, but burned at the edges. "This was nailed to my door last night," she said. "Whoever's behind this wants us afraid." Aldrich gently turned the figure over and frowned. The same strange mark was carved into its back. Bernadette continued, "There's an old rite tied to this, called the judgment of the bound limb. When nobles feared a revolt or scandal, they'd select someone from the village to receive the binding, a ritual act meant to absorb blame for sins they didn't commit. It was thought to appease both the law and the heavens. But no one believes that anymore," Justine said, shaking her head. "Belief isn't required," Bernadette replied grimly. "Only obedience." That night, as a storm began to roll across the hills, Lord Giroux's manor lit up with torchlight. Servants whispered of secret guests and strange documents being reviewed by candlelight. One claimed to have seen the Lord's personal guard escorting a hooded figure through the gardens toward the old wine cellar, which hadn't been opened in years. Others heard chant from below. Meanwhile, the village grew restless. Doors were bolted early, windows shuttered tight. People who hadn't spoken in weeks now gathered in kitchens and barns, trading stories that sounded too strange to be true. Stories of fields cursed for trespassing, livestock gone mad after grazing on tainted land, and children who spoke in tongues after wandering too close to the manor walls. Justine, Aldrich, and Bernadette met in secret again, this time in the stone crypt beneath the old church, away from prying eyes. Bernadette laid out what she believed was happening. Someone was reviving the forgotten laws, not for tradition, but for power. These strange laws weren't just relics. They were tools tools that allowed the elite to manipulate fear, erase opposition, and control the narrative. "Someone is preparing a judgment," she said quietly. "They've chosen a scapegoat." Justine's chest tightened. "Who?" There was a long pause. Bernadette looked at her with weary eyes. "You?" The air went still. Justine stared at her, heart pounding, throat dry. "Why me?" "Because you asked too many questions. Because you found what wasn't meant to be found. And because you're not from here. That makes it easier." The wind howled above the crypt, rattling the old beams. In the silence that followed, Justine realized something chilling. Someone had already begun the ritual, and time was running out. The sun had long dipped behind the crumbling stone walls of the village, casting the entire valley in shadow. Candles flickered behind shuttered windows, casting tall, jittery silhouettes that danced like ghosts across the dirt-packed roads. Somewhere near the old monastery ruins, the sound of a wooden cart creaked into the night, and a dog barked in the distance, then suddenly stopped. Life here moved with caution, always bracing for some strange new ordinance or punishment, never sure what old rule might resurface or how quickly it could cost someone everything. Benedict huddled near a smoky hearth inside a modest cottage just off the village square. Across from him sat Father Odo, the aging priest whose brittle hands trembled more from secrets than age. Between them lay a scroll, partially unrolled, and beside it, a small pouch of coins neither man wanted to touch. Odo's eyes, sunken from decades of silence and sin, glinted with something strange, perhaps fear, or maybe guilt. They revived it. The priest muttered, almost in a whisper, "The law about night whispers. Anyone heard speaking after the final bell, even to themselves, is to be punished as if invoking demons." Benedict looked up sharply. "But that law was abolished a century ago. You said so yourself." Odo sighed and leaned back. "That's what we thought. But the Lord's steward, Edric, he found a chest of old legal codices during the renovations at the manor. And he's enforcing them." "But why now?" Benedict asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Why dig up the strangest, cruelest laws when the village barely survives as it is? Odo hesitated. Because someone told him to. Someone with authority beyond Edric's own. And because there's something buried in those laws. Something coded. I used to think they were nonsense. But I've seen patterns, words that repeat across different scrolls. Names, places, warnings. Benedict's brow furrowed. Warnings? There's talk of a trial. A secret trial. Not for crime, but for thought. For questioning too much. For remembering things we were never meant to remember. Outside, a gust of wind hit the shutters, causing the old wood to groan. For a moment, Benedict imagined the village outside as a stage set for some absurd, unending play, with each citizen reciting their role in fear of forgetting a line and being dragged to the stocks, or worse. Just days ago, a traveling peddler had been chained to the village gate for selling mirrors larger than the palm of one's hand. Another revived law, allegedly to prevent vanity. But whispers said it was to stop people from seeing things reflected that weren't really there. Or perhaps things that were there but hidden from the eye. The law had not just returned, it had metastasized. Even within homes, windows were now to be covered after sundown by decree. To prevent spiritual infection, Edric claimed. Yet no one could define what that meant. The tailor's youngest daughter was fined 2 oxen for laughing after curfew. When her father couldn't pay, they took his hands. And all of it had been done under the seal of ancient authority. Benedict stood, his nerves tight. We can't let this go on. And do what? Odo asked, weariness folding over him like a cloak. Fight paper with fire? You'd only feed their fire. I want to find the source, Benedict said. If the laws are being revived, I want to know where they truly come from. Who first wrote them? Who profits from them now? Odo opened his mouth as if to object, but closed it again, then slowly nodded. There's one place, but I never dared go. Where? The Archivum, beneath the chapel at Wormford Abbey. It's said to be the original storage place of every ecclesiastical law ever passed across the empire. Many outlawed centuries ago. Some forgotten. Some hidden on purpose. And why haven't we gone? Benedict asked. Odo's hands trembled. Because the doors are sealed with chains. Not iron ones, but ones you don't see. Wards. Runes. I don't know who put them there, but anyone who has tried to break in has either vanished or returned without a memory of why they went. Benedict felt his chest tighten. It sounded like legend, but everything lately felt like it was drifting out of the realm of the reasonable. And yet, Odo added, voice thin, a rumor says that once every decade, the doors are unsealed for a single day. No one knows when. But there's a group. They watch. They wait. They prepare. Who? They call themselves the Index. Keepers of the last clean copies of the old world's laws. Not for obedience, but for protection. For proof. For the first time in days, Benedict felt a surge of something close to hope. How do I find them? They find you, Odo said grimly. But if you truly wish to be found, go to the bell tower at midnight. Carry no metal. Bring a candle lit from the hearth of someone who has confessed. And do not speak, not even to pray. Benedict nodded, sensing the danger, but knowing the risk of doing nothing was far worse. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the village, Lady Alice watched from a carved wooden balcony high above the square. Her eyes, sharp behind a lace veil, followed the movements of every lantern, every passerby, every shadow. She had not been born in this village, but since marrying Lord Everick, she had come to understand its pulse. And lately, its heart had begun to race. She had once studied ancient law herself, back when her life was still defined by libraries and not lands. What troubled her most wasn't that the laws were cruel or strange. It was how calculated their revival was. Like someone was playing a game, not just with power, but with time itself. Selecting which century to live by, what punishments to reimagine, and who should suffer first. Below, a group of boys ran past the fountain, silent, clutching something wrapped in cloth. Alice narrowed her eyes. Just before disappearing into the alley, one of them turned and stared up at her. His face was smeared with ash. His eyes glowed, unnaturally so, for the briefest second. Then he vanished into the dark. Back in Benedict's cottage, the candle had burned low. He stood by the window, unshuttered for now, watching the moon hang heavy like a witness to the madness below. He felt it all closing in, the laws, the silence, the eyes that watched but never blinked. He didn't know what waited at Wormford or whether the Index even truly existed. But something ancient was rising, and whatever it was, it had survived the centuries, not in dust but in power, and now it had teeth. As the rain thickened into a cold curtain over the uneven cobbled streets, Brother Auric stood silently under the rotting wooden overhang of the baker's shop, clutching his satchel as if it were his only tether to reason. The scrolls inside, written in a forgotten dialect and sealed in wax, seemed to hum in his hands, their presence strangely heavy, as if they carried not just words but centuries of unrest. Behind him, the monastery bell rang a long, slow toll. It was not time for prayer. It was a warning. People had begun whispering about Brother Auric ever since he returned from the ruins near St. Elwin's Cross. The place had been abandoned since the Great Plague, said to be cursed by the spirits of those who died unburied. But Auric had gone anyway, not out of defiance, but necessity. He was chasing answers, not for himself, but for the people. The millers crushed by levies, the women accused of witchcraft for boiling herbs, the families who had lost all their land to lords who never once stepped foot in the village. Auric believed the scrolls held something powerful, something that could unravel the web of old laws still binding common folk like prisoners. Down the lane, the clang of hooves and the barking of dogs signaled trouble. A squad of wardens in black and steel turned the corner, their torches glowing like angry eyes in the fog. At the head rode Bailiff Renard, a man feared not for cruelty, but for his unshakable loyalty to the Duke's ancient legal codes. He saw reform as rebellion and secrecy as sedition. He also knew about the scrolls. Auric ducked into a nearby alley, barely avoiding the light. He had no weapons, no plan, and no one left he could trust. The town that once praised his sermons now eyed him with suspicion. It wasn't personal. It was fear. People had seen what happened to those who questioned the laws, hanged as traitors, burned as heretics, forgotten as madmen. And yet, he couldn't let it go. Not now. In another corner of the duchy, across the craggy fields and the thick pine groves, young Eva tended to her bruises in silence. Her wrists bore the red marks of the stocks, and her ankle throbbed where the iron weight had cut into her skin. Her crime? Wearing her brother's old trousers to plow the field. Under the sumptuary laws, she had mocked divine order. But Eva, headstrong and unrepentant, didn't care about divine order, only about survival. Her parents were gone, lost to the pox, and her younger sister couldn't till the soil alone. The local reeve had punished her publicly, but his son, Tomas, had watched with something like shame in his eyes. That night, he slipped her a satchel of food and a page torn from his father's ledger. It was filled with strange markings, dates, and references to laws no one remembered ever being passed. Her village wasn't enforcing the Duke's laws. They were obeying someone else entirely. Eva, clever beyond her years, memorized the symbols before burning the page. Then she made her way toward the cloister town, hoping to find someone who could read what she could not. Back in the cloister, Alric met secretly with Father Baron, the only man of influence left who didn't serve the Duke blindly. They spoke in low tones behind the chapel's crumbling apse, under a stained glass window depicting Saint Judoc, the patron of lost causes. Baron listened without interrupting, his face unreadable beneath his thick gray beard. "There's something deeper, brother," Alric said. "These scrolls, they're older than the laws we follow. They speak of councils before the crowns, of land held by kin, not granted by decree. You're saying the laws are lies?" Baron asked. "No," Alric whispered. "I'm saying they've been rewritten, twisted." Baron leaned closer. "Then you must not speak of this aloud. Not yet. There are ears in stone and eyes in the firelight. And if Renard hears of this, there'll be no trial, only silence." "But how long must we stay quiet?" Alric's voice trembled. "The people suffer daily. Children are branded for stealing bread, while the Baron hunts deer for sport." Baron nodded, wearied by the truth. "You've seen what happened to those who tried before. The laws are not just scrolls and signatures. They are tradition, and tradition, my son, is the heaviest chain." That night, Alric couldn't sleep. He walked the edge of the cloister wall, passing the garden where the herbs grew wild. He paused at the rosemary patch, once tended by a healer named Miri, who had been burned during the last purge of the ungodly. Her only crime had been easing a merchant's dying pain without the priest's blessing. Alric still remembered the screams. Suddenly, from the north gate, came a quiet knock. Not the bold slam of guards, but a careful tap. 3 times, then silence. He opened the side slit and saw a mud-smeared girl in a brown hood, shivering from the cold. "Please," she said, "I think you're the one I'm supposed to find." Eva handed him a map drawn in charcoal and smudged with tears. It led to a place no longer named on any modern chart. A valley of stones said to be cursed, sealed by decree during the reign of King Thauric. She explained how her village kept records in secret, and how those records hinted at something older, forbidden. Alric studied the markings, stunned to see a symbol he'd only seen once before at the bottom of the ancient scrolls. A spiral within a square. It wasn't a mark of law. It was a mark of sealing. "We need to go there," he said quietly. "Will they kill us?" she asked. "Maybe," he replied. "But if we don't, they'll keep killing everyone else." By morning, news of a monk fleeing the cloister with a witch child reached Renard's ears. He summoned his men with a fury unlike any before. His orders were clear: bring them back, or don't come back at all. He feared what they might uncover, not because he believed it was true, but because he feared what the people might believe if it was. Meanwhile, in a cold stone tower overlooking the sea, an old noblewoman opened a rusted chest. Inside, wrapped in velvet and fear, was a second set of scrolls. She read the first line aloud and wept quietly. She had waited 60 years for someone else to rediscover the truth. As the wind howled through the marshes and the leaves fell like ashes across the fields, a sense of unrest began to grow. Whispers traveled faster than horses. Something was coming, something old and buried and hungry to be known again. And just as the sky broke in a storm over the hills, Eva and Alric crested the ridge overlooking the valley of forbidden stones. Below them lay the shattered remnants of an ancient court, where a kingdom once fell not by sword or sickness, but by silence. And the silence at last was cracking. Would they survive what lay ahead? Or would the truth they sought become the very trap they couldn't escape? That answer waited deep in the stone. The silence in the candlelit hall thickened, as if even the old stones held their breath. Brother Alaric stared at the parchment spread before him, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. It wasn't just the inked Latin that rattled him. It was the seal. Red wax, broken and worn with time, bore the emblem of a long-forgotten noble house. This law, hidden within layers of ecclesiastical text, wasn't merely strange. It was forbidden. It outlawed memory itself. A command from a long-dead king to erase a village, to strike it from all maps, all records, and all minds. Elena stood behind him, clutching a shawl to her chest, her breathing shallow. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Why would they do that?" Brother Alaric's voice was low. "Because something happened there. Something the crown wanted buried so deep that even mentioning its name became treason." The fire cracked in the hearth, the only sound between them. Outside, the wind howled against the monastery walls. In the village below, something had stirred. Elena had sensed it days ago. Animals avoiding the edges of the woods, sudden illnesses without cause, and that strange sensation that someone was always watching. Now, it all made a terrible kind of sense. "They called it Lex Oblivionis," Alaric continued. "The law of forgetting. It wasn't just about silencing the people. It ordered priests to alter sermons, scribes to burn letters, and even midwives to rename newborns. It was erasure at the root of life." Elena whispered, "Is that even possible?" "It was in those times," he said. "Medieval Europe had laws for things modern minds cannot accept. You could be arrested for wearing certain colors, for whistling in a cathedral, for owning more than one mirror. But this was different. This law was built not to punish, but to hide." As they spoke, the bell in the village square rang out once, sharply, an alarm, not a marking of the hour. Elena turned toward the window, heart pounding. "We're too late," she said. Down the hill, the small houses glowed dimly through mist and smoke. Figures moved in the fog, slow, deliberate. Not soldiers, not townsfolk. Their outlines were wrong, twisted by shadow or maybe by something more. Brother Alaric reached for the iron key that hung from a hook beside the fireplace. "There's one last place," he said. "The catacombs beneath the old chapel. If there are answers, they'll be buried there." They descended into the dark, lantern flickering with each step. Beneath the chapel, the stones were older, colder. Moss crept along the walls, and ancient bones peeked through cracks in the crypt floor. The hallway narrowed, leading to a sealed wooden door. Alaric's key turned with resistance, the lock coughing as it opened for the first time in what must have been centuries. Inside, the chamber was round. At its center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a stone box wrapped in iron chains. Alaric approached slowly. "This box," he said, "is mentioned in the margins of a 9th century ledger. It was never to be opened. The law not only erased the village, it locked away the memory itself inside this." Elena's voice was a whisper. "Then why is it still here?" "I think," he said, "because not even the law could destroy it." But just as his hands touched the lid, a chill swept through the chamber. The lantern flickered out, and in the pitch black they heard it. A breath. Not theirs. Something ancient. Watching. Elena grabbed his arm. "We shouldn't be here." "I know," Alaric said, "but we are." With trembling hands, he unlatched the chain. The lid groaned open. Inside lay a scroll, sealed with the same red wax, and a mirror, no bigger than a palm. Alaric reached for the scroll, but stopped. The mirror reflected nothing. Not him, not Elena, not even the room. He picked it up, and suddenly everything around them shifted. The chamber warped, like the stone itself recoiled from the artifact. The bones scattered across the ground began to twitch. "Alaric!" Elena cried out, stepping back. He held the mirror to the wall. "It's not just memory. This law, it didn't erase the village because of a crime. It erased it to protect the rest of the world." From the dark, the bones began to rise, assembling, clicking together in unnatural ways. Human skulls with too many teeth. Rib cages fused with antlers. They weren't remains. They were warnings. "They tried to contain it," Alaric whispered. "But they failed." Elena turned to run, but the doorway had vanished. Only stone now, as if the crypt had never opened. They were sealed inside. With it. "Wait," she said. The scroll. Alaric broke the wax and unrolled it with shaking fingers. The text wasn't Latin. It was older. Symbols danced across the page, alive, shifting like water. But he understood. It wasn't a curse. It was an instruction, a choice. "We can end it," he said, looking at her. "But we'll have to pay the price." The mirror began to glow faintly. The creatures surrounding them paused, as if waiting. Elena stepped forward. "What kind of price?" Alaric met her eyes. "Our names. Our lives. If we follow the right, we'll never have existed. But the village, the world, will stay safe." She looked at the bones, the mirror, the scroll. And then she nodded. "Then do it." But before Alaric could begin the ritual, a rumble shook the walls. The creatures lurched, one of them letting out a shriek that splintered the air. From a mirror, a new figure emerged, not bone, not beast. A man, tall, cloaked, eyes like empty wells. "You found it," he said softly. "After all these years." Alaric stepped back, holding the scroll to his chest. "Who are you?" "I'm a law's enforcer," the figure replied. "I ensure the forgetting. And now, I've come to erase you." The stones above cracked, dust falling from the ceiling. The mirror pulsed. Elena grabbed Alaric's arm, her eyes wide. "If we do nothing, we die," she said. "If we use the scroll, we vanish," he finished. The enforcer stepped closer. "There's a third way. You give it to me. You walk away. Forget this place. Forget the truth." Elena looked at Alaric. "What do we do?" He stared down at the scroll, then up at the mirror. The room buzzed with energy, time itself seeming to stretch. He had seconds to decide. And then he chose. In the final days of his quiet life, Thomas often sat near the window of the old stone cottage, letting the wind whisper through the glassless panes as he reflected on everything that had passed. The village had changed, and so had he. The laws he once feared, the punishments he once hid from, and the strange traditions that had ruled his youth now felt like faded etchings on a wall that no one looked at anymore. Time had moved on, but the memories still lived inside him like shadows, some dark, some oddly comforting. Alex still came to visit from time to time. His notebook had long since been filled, but now he brought other historians with him. Some were curious, some skeptical, but all listened with quiet awe to the tales Thomas shared. Stories of pig trials, beard taxes, and strange medieval customs that, while once deadly serious, now sounded like absurd dreams from another world. Yet behind the laughter, behind the raised eyebrows, they all sensed the deeper truth. The laws might have been strange, but they were real. And for the people who lived under them, they shaped everything. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the wooden floor in orange and gold, Thomas handed Alec a worn, folded piece of parchment. The handwriting was nearly illegible, ink faded with time, but Alec recognized the seal. It was one of the old village decrees, long outlawed now, that sentenced a man to public humiliation for cutting down a tree without noble permission. A tree. Thomas looked at Alec and said simply, "That man was my uncle. He didn't survive the stocks." Alec's smile faded. He tucked the paper carefully into his satchel, knowing some truths deserved to be preserved, even when they hurt. Word had gotten out beyond the village. Tourists, scholars, and even documentary crews made their way to the tiny hamlet to hear the last witness of medieval law. Some brought cameras. Others brought questions. One even brought a carved replica of a scold's bridle, which Thomas refused to touch. "We don't wear ghosts," he said, voice firm. That evening, he told Alex something he had never shared with anyone. When he was a boy, He had watched a woman paraded through the streets with a bridle on her head. Her crime? Gossip. Her face had haunted his dreams for decades, not because of what she did, but because he did nothing. As the village slowly became something of a historical curiosity, changes began to follow. A small museum opened. Locals, once silent, now proudly recited the strange laws of their past like folklore, no longer in shame, but as part of their identity. The law about animals standing trial became a favorite tale, especially among school children who giggled at the thought of a goat hiring a lawyer. But even in the humor, there remained a quiet understanding that history wasn't always kind, and ignorance had once been deadly. Alec eventually published his book. He called it The Strange Laws of Medieval Europe, and in the dedication, he wrote, "For Thomas, who remembered when the rest of us forgot." The book became a modest success, drawing curious readers from around the world. It wasn't just a collection of odd rules and punishments. It was a human story. It told of lives shaped by fear, by custom, by superstition, and of one man who carried all of it in his heart, long after the world had moved on. Years passed. Seasons came and went like breath, and the village settled into a rhythm of gentle remembering. Thomas grew older, but his eyes remained clear. He often said, "We're only free now because someone remembered how it used to be." People listened. One day, Alec returned with his daughter. She was no older than Thomas had been when he first saw the bridal. She listened carefully, asking questions no one else had thought to ask. Not about the punishments, but about the people. "Did they know it was unfair?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Most did. But knowing something is wrong isn't the same as having the power to stop it. The girl looked down at her notebook, thoughtful. Then she asked, "What gave you the power?" Thomas smiled, remembering. That night, as the fire crackled low and the stars peeked through the heavy thatch, Thomas wrote one final letter. It was short, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Inside, he wrote about the importance of remembering, not just the facts, not just the events, but the people, the ones who laughed despite the loss, the ones who wept in silence, the ones who vanished because no one dared speak, and the ones who lived long enough to tell the truth. When Thomas passed, the village bell rang, not for mourning, but for honor. Children left wildflowers by his door. Alec read the letter aloud under the old elm tree, the same one Thomas had nearly been punished for climbing as a boy. The story had come full circle, not with revenge, not with resolution, but with remembrance. And so the strange laws of medieval Europe, once tools of fear and control, had become something else entirely. They became stories, lessons, warnings, and strangely, even comfort, reminders that we've come far, that justice grows, and that even the most bizarre rules can one day be outgrown. The tale of Thomas and his village stayed alive, not in courtrooms or bookshelves, but in hearts, in fireside talks, in quiet moments under old trees. In the end, the story didn't need a hero. It needed someone who remembered, and someone who listened.